All right, we are back once again with Rebbe Leo Rappaport of Chicago. And I realized we forgot to mention Zera Wichtige Zach the previous time that we spoke, which is that Rosh Hashem, you had a baby boy, Mazel Tov, and I understand the bris is this Friday morning.
Yeah, Rosh Hashem.
Rosh Hashem should be zeichet to be megadolim, a total chupel ma'asim tovim.
Somebody sent me a message after the video that I talked, and they didn't say Mazel Tov, and then he told me that his grandfather, they had a baby in Elul. His great grandfather had a baby in Elul, and Elul hat nicht gerät and Vardika, and Motzim Kippur he came home to say Mazel Tov. So.
Right. That was definitely the reason. No, I mean, it's unscripted, so sometimes we forget important things.
Yeah.
Hopefully we won't forget any important details this time. Speaking of last time, we got some nice feedback from the last one, and the Iker, I think that the number of people commented that it really, besides the nice connection and the historical tie in Bechulu, I think for a lot of people the mashal itself had become so abstract and so dry, and like I say, it became another sugya along with the nimshal. Nacha sugya, diyukim, treating it like it's a taisvus, as opposed to a mashal supposed to be mitzayir the Indian for you for real in real life, and the derech halimud of chassidus and just being removed from the world of kings made it such that for a lot of people it's just a dry thing, and maybe v'ani b'seicham. So to be able to approach it from a more realistic perspective, to understand the mitzias, to understand the context, whether or not there are some people, I'm sure there's a miyut of people that didn't like the idea of connecting it to a specific thing. Fine, it doesn't have to be connected to that if you don't want it to, but understand the mitzias. And amount of times, as we mentioned, the Rebbe mentions a melech dilamata, and I just saw another one from the Farbrengen of Yud Gimel Tashim Beis that we'll get to actually today for another reason. The Rebbe mentions a melech dilamata. Even when he's in the field, the more Reivam, the more Hadras Melech. So right there, it sounds like the Rebbe is describing an official appearance of the king of the Sada, and in the context of the Farbrengen, it sounds a little like the Rebbe is referring to the appearing at the Farbrengen is like coming down to the Sada and the Reivam Hadras Melech. That's sort of the context Rebbe likes to mention. Reivam Hadras Melech a lot in the Farbrengens, the idea of the tzibur, the amount of people that are there. So there's a mitzias behind the mashal, and I got feedback from a number of people, different stripes, that it really
perhaps kind of more people who are listening to join the WhatsApp chat where further marmakaimis are shared, supporting against, and but is to further clarify and v'chulu.
All right, like I said, I think the postscript, we welcome pushback. If it's a good time, a good maramakim, we like that. I just don't like announcing my phone number or putting a link in the chat. So you do have to figure out how to find me or Rebbe Rappaport, but it shouldn't be that difficult. Chavre Islay, and we're all 2-3 steps removed from each other. Do the game, and certainly among Yidden and Jewish geography, it shouldn't be more than 2 or 3 steps removed. So having said that, let's move along to the Indian that I wanted to discuss tonight, which is, it's sort of based on a Maimer in L'Kutei Torah, Parshas Kiseitze, but it's also more general Indian regarding the attitude to Rosh Hashana, the feeling of Rosh Hashana, the Yom HaDin aspect of Rosh Hashana, which I think we alluded to briefly last time, and also even perhaps a bit more controversially, never sure how controversial we want to go. Never go full controversial, probably. But there's always this bit of a controversy about talking about schar v'einish, or talking about einish for Yidden, or even for Nisht Yidden, as we'll see. We know that online, if you want to get a lot of attention, you want to get a lot of upvotes, downvotes, comments. There's a whole chevra that like to koch in einish, punishments. And sometimes there's like this impression that the Chabad on the opposite end of the extreme, no punishments. Again, I don't want to get too involved in that controversy, but I think the chaymer, the topic we'll be discussing here, is definitely very relevant to that, and presents a more nuanced picture as to the fact that on the one hand, avada lefi all the makaitis, we have the same schar v'einish and the same yom hadin and all of that. However, there is a very strong nuance about how we talk about it and the sensitivity that we have when we talk about it. And maybe sometimes, as we say, something could become megushim, something could become vergrept, and it turns into something else. But hopefully we'll see with greater nuance why we're very, very careful, very sensitive about not being mekatrig, as we'll see, not only on Yidden, but even on Nisht Yidden, which is a very interesting point that doesn't get mentioned nearly as much. But let's start with...
One thing that comes to mind, again, I haven't sort of looked through all the Makoros that you prepared, but there is, I think, at least in my sort of awareness of this sugya, a very important article in Hechel Baal Shem Tov. I have in my head that it's from Reb Nachum Greenwald, although I don't remember if it's officially under his name or under a pen name, where he goes through the history of Yiras HaEinish in the Torah of the Alter Rebbe. But one particular tidbit, or if you will, that sticks out to me is something that's printed in one of the volumes of my Morad Morazokin, but it's more like a Yechidus than a Maimer or a Drush, where the Alter Rebbe says to this Chassid, like, something along the lines of, Chassidim obviously like to present themselves as if they don't need to talk about Yiras HaEinish and they help Necha from them. But if you were really holding there, then you wouldn't get so bent out of shape when your parnasa and your gesund wasn't the way you want it to be. So to me, that sort of registered with me that on the one hand, this sort of narrative that maybe in Chabad we're not quote unquote so into that, or whatever the exact way to say it is. On the one hand, maybe it's not new, maybe it was way back there from the beginning, and at the same time, there's also, there's truth to it, and also there's pushback to it. So,
right. So it's really a whole separate subject. We're not really going to get into the inyan of Einish in Teiras Chabad. I have a whole, at least one file on it somewhere with probably what you're mentioning and other sources. Essentially, there's this idea of how both schar and Einish are sort of selfish things, and Chabad is very much about not focusing on the self, but to being selfless and bittul. So. Working for schar, working for Einish is very selfish. So then there's this vart that schar is taka feh no matter what, but Einish, this goes back to the Alter Rebbe, the Rebbe Shab repeats it, it's repeated in a number of places. Einish, lamaitze, if a person needs to remind himself of the Einish, it's okay, it's allowed. So that's sort of the attitude to it in a nutshell. And pointed out many times, the Alter Rebbe in Tanya casually almost seems to make a point of mentioning some of the traditional ancient, the kafakela, etc. So sometimes Chassidus will mention Gehenim Shel Sheleg. Often it mentions about the Nahar Dinur. These are all things, classic Jewish sources about ancient that the Alter Rebbe definitely mentions, not as like an emphasis, and it's not let's sit down now and talk about ancient, but it's part of the Jewish library, part of the world of Jewish ideas that the Alter Rebbe tends to take every idea and turn it into inyan of bittul, inyan of avos Hashem. So the punchline is always about bittul and avos Hashem, but it's definitely in the collection of ideas. But that's all a separate talk, a separate discussion. This is going to be more about the idea of din and kitrug and talking about punishments, more the discourse about Einshin rather than the Einshin themselves. So in this week's Parsha, Parshas Kiseitze, Grad at the end of the Aliyah for Shlishi. This is being recorded at an undisclosed hour between Yom Shlishi and Yom Revi, but we're coming off of Yom Shlishi. So towards the Aliyah, at the end of the Aliyah, the beginning.
What the Rambam means, is that
the? I've made jokes like that, but yeah. So towards the end of the Aliyah, there's a pasuk that talks about Lo Yavai Amoinu Mo'avi B'Kahal Hashem. So no Amoinu Mo'avim accepted or allowed. And it gives a bit of a background on the history, which isn't so common for mitzvahs and leisas lavin in the Torah. But here it says, Al Dvara Shlikidmu Eschem Alechem B'Mayim, etc., etc. And then it mentions Vasher Sachar Alecha as Bilam Ben Ba'ar. First of all, they didn't meet you with food. Second, they didn't give you a nice welcome. Never mind that, they even hired Bilam Ben Ba'ar, the Kalaleka. And then the Torah goes off kaviyachol and adds, and by the way, when they hired Bilam, Hashem leikacha l'shmaya Bilam, vayafach Hashem leikacha l'chos hakol l'bracha, ki ahevcha Hashem leikacha. By the way, Hashem didn't want to listen to Bilam, and Hashem turned the kol into a bracha. And then the pasuk continues and goes back to the lav, l'sidra shleimam b'tevasam kol yamecha la'olam. It's an interesting little mini parsha, little mini inyan in this week's parsha.
Yaakov Leufer on his weekly email last week made a whole, and 2 weeks ago, was talking a lot about Maimer HaMuskar, and he pointed out that Dafka and Sefer Dvarim, you have this phenomena a lot, that there's half a pasuk or a whole pasuk, and sometimes even a few pasukim that are clearly parentheses, sort of a hyphenated clause in the middle of a longer discussion, which is clearly what's going on over here with pasuk Vav of Hashem leikacha l'shmaya Bilam. It's
right. I think he was commenting even more specifically when it's part of a pasuk, and then the trup, the timing, can sort of indicate.
Yeah, that was he started with that, but then he moved on also to. He showed. I think the longest example he had was even 5 or 6 psukim, but yeah. Anyway, he was. I think it's part of a bigger topic, which is not for now, about how the difference in the style of psukim and Sefer Dvarim versus the rest of Chumash. But anyway. Right.
Exactly. Right. So the source we're moving on to now is this week's Likutei Torah. So you have a number of Mamarim in the Likutei Torah. You have Kiseitze 1, Kiseitze 2. Third one, forgetting Libra Maschel, but it's about Kisiena Leish Nashim, maybe that's Taka Libra Maschel. And then, not counting Biyurim, then you have V'loi Ava. Not counting Biyurim, I think there are 5 Mamarim. This would be the 4th Maimer. So V'loi Ava is it's Shtang on this pasuk, which is already interesting, and I think I've said this before. I don't know if I've said it recently, but I have this distinction in the Torah of the Alter Rebbe that not all the Torahs of the Alter Rebbe are proper mamarim, formal mamarim in the formal sense, that it's said as a Torah drush barabim. But rather, some of them, we know that Alter Rebbe used to talk in Torah with members of his family, by the Sudas. So there's a certain number of Torahs that I would characterize are probably closer, were closer in style originally to Sichas. But there was no official distinction back then between a Maimer and a Sicha. Even the word Maimer is a recent term. The term was Drush, which is its own interesting topic and discussion. When did the term Maimer almost replace Drush? But not getting into that. But back then it does seem like, using the terms you would use today, there are certain Torahs that are more in nature of a Sicha rather than a Maimer. So this too may be something like that, and a lot of the other things we will mention soon seem to be like that, because Le'ava doesn't sound like necessarily like a traditional beginning of a full proper Maimer. So this is something the Alter Rebbe said, Shabbos Parshas Kiseitze, Tafkuf Samach Vav. I didn't look in too much detail, but I think there are other Torahs from that Shabbos, which again may suggest, maybe one was the main one, and then there were the secondary ones. At any rate, this is printed in the Likutei Torah. There's also Anach of the Mittel Rebbe printed in Tafkuf Samach Vav. So the Maimer of the Likutei Torah begins at this pasuk B'lei Ava. I'm going to be looking, for those watching, I'm going to be looking a bit off screen for more of the time this time. I do have a lot of material that I will be looking at a bit more directly. So this is Maimer B'lei Ava. And so the shaila is, Mawa Pella HaGodel V'atz, what this great Pella that doesn't want to listen to an Ish Bliyal, as a schlechter Mensch like Bilam Harasha. And if you tell me he didn't listen, so then why is Vayafech Hashem as a klala lebracha? So is there a klala, or there's not? If you're not listening, so there's no klala. I don't know if we'll get to the Terutzim, but okay, the questions are interesting. So right away, the Maimer begins like this, and this caught my eye. I was just, earlier this evening, just looking through the Maimer Likutei Torah, wanted to see what they're about. If I'm allowed to drop a tip or mention that I actually was using AI in my process. I sort of saved right now Chabad.org has a Torah texts section of their website. Give them a free plug. So on their Torah texts page, you can get each Maimer of Likutei Torah as one long flowing page of text, which I think is the only place online where you can get that. There are other places where you can get like an Amud at a time, a column at a time for Likutei Torah. Here you can get the actual full Maimer as a page. hope this is hope what I'm saying is in line with the terms and conditions of the website. Anyway, so I saved each page of just Mamar Mat Biyurim, saved each page as an HTML file, and then I uploaded all 5 HTML files to Gemini, which is the one I use, and I have a pro account. So if people are using AI, I encourage people to try to use a paid account, a pro account on the stronger, higher levels, especially when it comes to Yom of Torah. If it's stam random inyanim you're looking up stuff around your house, then you don't need to use the heavy version. Either if you're concerned begashmias about using AI too much, or just it's not necessary. When it comes to Torah and you don't want it to hallucinate, so the better a model you use, the less likely, hopefully, it is that it will hallucinate. And even then, you have to know what to use it for, and you have to develop a chush in a sense. So I downloaded all 5 pages, and I uploaded all 5 pages.
So you're teasing that you would do a course to teach how to do it.
Maybe in the near future we'll do something like that, right? Exactly. So this is a teaser of that. Also very important, if you're using AI, it's better to put the text, so you know what text you're asking it about. Better to upload the text directly rather than just ask it as in the Veltarain, right? I could do the same thing. I can just ask it, tell me what the 5 Amorim L'Kutei Torah Parshas Kisei are about. Ask it open-endedly and hope that it gets the right information. But I'm not hoping it's going to do that. I uploaded all 5 Amarim directly, and I said, please tell me, summarize the major points of each mimer. And this is sort of, I just made this part of my process. That way, you open a sefer. I've spoken before. People open a sefer Shabbos morning, and they don't get past a few lines. So you never really get a sense of what there is, what you're missing, and which part you may have preferred to learn if you knew what was in there. And L'Kutei Torah doesn't come with summaries. Even the Chabad summaries sometimes are, in my opinion, like very heavy, and there's different ways to summarize a mimer. So even some of this from I do have summaries. So I asked it to summarize the 5 for me. That way I can get at a glance. I can see what the 5 mamar and what the 5 sugyas are, and work from there. So when I saw the summary of this, I said, okay, that looks interesting, and from there, obviously, I took over. We got to let the humans take over from there. But I thought it would be interesting just to share that was part of my process of looking to see what's going on in the Sukkot L'Kutei Torah, and that way I can jump to mimer number 4. I don't have to slog through. I mean, not chas v'shalom. It's all Torah. You're supposed to go through the whole Seder Shaparsha. But again, lefi hamaduber kama ba'amim, that at the very least, especially for those that struggle with finishing the whole thing, there's definitely an Indian to know what's going on in there, and to see what you're drawn to and attracted to, and what you can get the most benefit from. So this is possibly, I'm giving away some of the sidus. This is possibly a way to shorten that time and to be able to focus and see what's going on. Even if you learn the mimer straight from beginning to end, it's good to have a good summary at the beginning, so you know where it's going. So the mimer immediately goes off in an interesting direction. It starts off and it says, "Inyan hu sheyesh mekatrigim shemekatrigim al Yisrael." I think it's the whole lashon is like, not, I wouldn't say completely unusual, but especially by the style of the L'Kutei Torah, it's a little interesting to start off. Inyan hu sheyesh mekatrigim shemekatrigim al Yisrael. Like I said, it sounds a bit more like a sikha. By the standards of that time, sounds a bit more like a sikha. So the mekatrigim. So this is a sprach that we use, that there are those that are mekatrig l'mayla on Yidden. Shelachach noiten shofar b'Rosh Hashana. Let's talk about the reason why we have a shofar. La'arbev kateger, to confuse the kateger. Kateger, a mekatrig are sort of interchangeable words. Whether or not they are etymologically related, I didn't check. V'hu shemechapes achar avonos b'nei Yisrael. So there's a bit of an emphasis here. There's a knetch, a kvetch. What's a kateger? We're being ma'arb of the kateger. What's a kateger? What's a mekatrig? The Indian of a mekatrig is he's looking, he's searching, he's seeking, looking for averis, and being didactic and picking on it to be able to interpret it badly and present a negative report, a negative review. That's a mekatrig. Before we continue, just to point out, the idea of mekatrigim on Rosh Hashana, I think, is an idea that you see if you read the stories from Amol. I think was a bit more present in people's mind, in people's speech, in people's imagination, versus today. If you hear the stories is one thing, otherwise it sort of fades back. It's not so much the sprach today, but I think everyone who's familiar with Chassidus Shemaisis from the first day of Chassidus knows that there's always these stories where it's come to Rosh Hashana, and Mitzayir Holtzir Lamaila comes the Yom Hadin, right? Sometimes there are stories about how a person's neshama comes Lamaila, and then he has a din, and there's a big scale, and they put the mitzvahs on this side of the scale, and the others on that side of the scale, and the Melitza Yosher for the person come running, and they are Melitza Yosher for him, and the Kateger, the Malachi Chabala, whatever terms come, and they bring all the Averis. Huh?
No, there's certainly many stories that we grew up on, which focus on Rosh Hashana, about the tzaddik who couldn't blow the shofar, and then the Mevarich HaNoshim and Mevarich HaShanim, and the Maisa with the, which everybody knows from Avram Fried singing Yom Tefelech with the Yitzchak and the mother with the Pidyon, and all these type of stories.
Right, the hearts von Amama, right. So Levi Yitzchak Barditchev Bechlal, of course, comes up a lot in these types of stories, either being Melitz Yesher here Lamata, or being Melitz Yesher Lamaila, as Einteinen mit the Eibishter. Sometimes the Einteinen happens here Lamata, sometimes I think there are stories where it's happening Lamaila, right? I think the Kaina Avodav B'Yem Din is a story we heard as a kid. I heard as a kid, and I think it was part of the stories they taught in yeshiva. It was like on the curriculum of like, you get to the piyut of L'Kei Leirach Din, so the story is the Kaina Avodav B'Yem Din. That's the punchline, whatever.
About buying the Averis or something?
Honestly, I have to remind myself what the story is. That's just the bottom line, is that he paused in the Piyut Lamata, and a whole Maisa happened Lamaila, and then like the punchline of the Din Udvarim Lamaila was L'Kaina Avodav. Somehow, like, so we'll be sold as slaves to the Eibishter, so if we're sold as slaves to the Eibishter, so then that somehow paters us from the ganze Zach, so that's L'Kaina Avodav B'Yem Din, something like that. I have to do Chazar attack on the Gersa de Yankas in these stories. Like I said, these stories are not so they aren't so on the top of the mind, or the sprach that we talk today so much. But at least as children, I think we're exposed to them a bit more. Have to check how the chinuch is doing these days in this regard. So as I started saying, you have versions of this when it comes to the person himself coming Lamaila after 120, and then you have versions of this on a grander scale, which is Taka Oiskalt and Lefina B'Kairis, that on a grander scale, the Yom Hadin, weiter, you have all the Melitza Yesher coming to be Melitza Yesher on Ganz Klal Yisrael, and you have the Mekatregim, sometimes you say it's the Satan Alein, that comes to be Mekateg also of Ganz Klal Yisrael, and hoping that's the Sprach, that we're hoping the Eibishter will be Mechriya, L'schos, and the tzaddikim are involved in that, and in the earlier stories, it's like the tzaddikim are Elul Lamaila and are standing and pleading and part of the story. I want to just add a detail of thought, which is that there was a mechaber by the name of Yisrael Klappholz, I think was his name. I grew up reading one of the sets of books that he wrote was Eitzer Agados. He was malakad all the Agados on Tanakh in a sort of a readable fashion many decades ago, before all the more modern versions of that came out. So it was in Hebrew and in Yiddish. I read the Yiddish one when I was very young. But he has other likutim. When I got Eitzer Chachma, I discovered all his other likutim. So in his likutim, one of his likutim is all the stories about based in Shalmaila. I think Taka, whether it's Achamei Vasidim or on Rosh Hashana Yom Kippur, he was malak every single story about based in Shalmaila, a story that's set where there's a scene taking place in based in Shalmaila. And I think I mentioned about Sipur Nemaitz yesterday. I use it for bedtime, but it's half as bedtime and half as an opportunity to go through it myself. So the same goes for that book by Klappholz. I also used it a few years ago, half as bedtime and half to go through it, half and a half as an opportunity to go through it. And it's interesting to look at it a little bit academically, to pay attention to the pratim of different stories. So you see certain themes, certain commonalities, but then you see certain differences as well in how the scene based in Shalmaila is being described. So the shaila is, what exactly is the deal? What exactly is the gather? So I would submit. Obviously, it's a sensitive, it's a dakistic inyan, but I would suggest that all the stories are sort of, one extent or another, or lakad of adover el haseichel, right? Is it really our contention that things take place lamayla like a soap opera, like it's like as if you could like film it. You can take a film and you can film how these malachim come and say this, and those malachim come crashing in and they say that, and it's back and forth. It's very dramatic. Is that mamish exactly precisely? Is that the emunah that it's exactly fazal oifa? Or I would suggest that it's definitely Yom Hadin, but obviously it's a ruchnistik oifen that we probably can't be masig exactly. But apparently there's an inyan, whether it comes to Yom Hadin, whether it comes to other things, that we're supposed to be mitzayir to ourselves, supposed to use the koyach hamadama, as maybe Rebbe Nachman or others would say. You have to, picture it to yourself in a certain way. And Lamaisa, everyone pictures it to themselves. There are certain general themes that are makubal of how to picture it, but what the exact pratim, how to picture it, probably is a bit different from person to person.
I would say that even the very notion that you're confusing the Satan, or in the language of the Maimir, confusing the Mekatrik, la Arbev, Hakateger, I mean, that's also, the Rebbe speaks about it, what it means exactly, but it's also a more sort of, what's the word? It's more sort of mukhshis commercial. We don't actually mean that there's a Satan who's getting confused by the fact that you're, whatever, not blowing shofar enough for Rosh Hashana, or yes, blowing shofar on Rosh Hashana. But it means something more substantial in that we're using this language, the karav l'seichel.
Right. I mean, the mahalach of that sikha is to move it a bit away from like a more fagrepta pashut havana to a more darkistic havana. When the Satan sees kach v'kach v'kach, so he realizes kach v'kach, as opposed to a very literal depiction. But maybe when you talk to children, and the Rebbe says this in a number of places, a lot of things in Amunah where you tell it to the children one way, and then you get older, you realize it's a bit more darkistic. And I would suggest that, again, not to get into a whole fight, but those that have a kach and einshim and describe the einshim in a certain way, I think to some extent the same is true in a lot of these areas where, as a person has to, like we said earlier, even Chassidus, it says a person has to remind himself of einshim if that's what is necessary and that's helpful. And in order to remind oneself of it, you have to be mitzayir. You have to be mitzayir a certain way. There are certain nekudas descriptions that we find in the Mekayros, and the person probably should be mitzayir it additionally further to himself. But it doesn't mean that every prat is meant to be understood kipshutay, that this is exactly, if you came with a camera, you took a video, it would look like this, as opposed to trying to put it in the form of physical tzir. And maybe this is takamadoyak in the Rambam. Look, in the Rambam, when it comes to einish, it comes to din, the Rambam doesn't get into any of this. It's been mired very much in any of these details, and like the Rebbe says, the Rambam is the halachas. So al pi halacha, darf man wissen that faran einish, faran din, but how exactly the einish works and how exactly din works, we can't truly know exactly, especially in Oif and Gashmi. But from all the other Mekayos, Kumta is that you have to be Mitzayir at Bechlolos in these Eifanim. But sometimes, today you have Likutim that are malak at every single Makar. And this Makar describes it Azoy, and this Makar describes it as like Klapot at least wasn't trying to turn it into encyclopedia. He just collected all the stories. But try to turn it into encyclopedia. This one says this detail, this one says that detail. Is every detail like meant to be taken as like a entry in encyclopedia, or it's a more darkistic azach? That's what I would suggest about using Yom. So that's also part of what bothers people when you come and you start talking about ancient. You talk about it in a very, very pashut way, even though the Armakaitis, Sikh the Armakaitis that say it that way. But the question is, what do you do with that? How do you apply it? Do you just apply it to yourself? Is that how you're mitzayir to yourself, as opposed to just screaming it at someone else? That's a less edel oifen. So this is an area with edel kind of sensitivity. And so sometimes taking it in a grub oifen and is itself off-putting and not necessarily helpful. But what we see here is that the Alter Rebbe certainly is still talking in this sprach, that l'mayla, the Mekatrigim. This ties into the point we made about Yom Hadin, Rosh Hashana, and some people weiter today, some people on the Lubavitch end of the spectrum that almost go a little too far, a little too extreme, and say, what, Yom Hadin, Kabbalah Samachos, being Mamlech Eibishter. And that's also sort of missing the point. It's just that we talk about it with more of an edelkeit, and we try to focus more on the Eibishter more than on ourselves. So there's a lot more emphasis on that, as opposed to making it all very self-centered and self-centric. But of course, all these aspects are still there in Yiddishkeit, and they're still there in Chassidus, and you start paying attention and look for it, you'll notice, and even in the Rebbe's talks. So I think I was going to mention at some point, I think the Rebbe didn't use the terms of Kitrug, Mekatrigim, so like he didn't talk in that sprach so much, maybe compared to Amal, and that could either be because Bechlau today it's just a little bit less of the sprach, or because the Rebbe has even more how many sensitivities the Rebbe had about not expressing certain things. So it's hard to know. The Rebbe doesn't express it. Is it because that's a shita that we don't talk about it as much, or it's a Rebbe shazach, not even put the words to paper or express the words. But of course, like we said, there's the sikh of the Rebbe about Larbe Vasot, and of course it's present. The idea is present there everywhere, whether it's the Satan, whether it's the idea of Mekatrigim. Chabad, we have our own version of talking about Keturugim Lamayla, Keturugim and Chassidus. So the idea is always present in some form or another. So the Maimer, back to the Kutei Torah, the Maimer says, so you have Mekatrigim or Mekatrigim, and that's why we have the Shofar. And what's a Mekatrig? What's a Kateger? Zucht, he's looking for Avinus, he wants to be Malamed Choyva. Oh, so that's Bilam. That's Bilam. Shekacha Yedarke Shel Bilam Gamken. Shayimechapes Gamken Limtzei Mokim Oven Yisrael. That's Bilam perfectly. That's Bilam exactly. That was his thing. Bilam's thing is to look for Averis, right? So that's the whole story, and it starts rattling off. And the whole story, he keeps on looking for places for future Averis. So like Bilam is like in the Torah, Bilam is the archetype of someone who is looking for Averis. So this is essentially why I'm quoting this, why I'm bringing this, because here it's a little bit more b'merumas, and we'll see a few more Makairos where it's spelled out even more. But here we're sort of hinting to the fact that Azah Einer, someone that has a koch, has a geschmack in looking for bad, speaking about the bad, broadcasting the bad, so that's called a kitrug, and that's called being a mekatrig, and that's called being a bilam. As we'll see later, anyone has like a shmak and oinshim, as we'll see, anyone has like a shmak and oinshim is taken to mean that the person is himself a schlechter, that it comes from schlechtskeit. So all of that is also, I would say, merumas here, bekitzer, and that shekacha yedarke shel bilam, and it's not the line before, wasn't a kateger, there's like a bit of like a general, there's like a hint to the fact that this is a general klal, it's a klal gadol, not just Lamaila, but whether it's Bekatchim Lamaila Yemadin, or whether it's Bilam, or whether it's in any context, being Mechapas Acha Venis Bnei Yisrael, Daktak Acharem, Lalamad Alei Mechayva, das is a Bilam. Continues and says, so that's the Shavach Sheshib Chakasav, that even though he came with a taina, and he came with real tainas, it was based on real Averis. So what does the Rebbe do when you come with Ketrugim, with real Averis? Le'ava Avayalekacha L'Shmaya. What does Le'ava mean? It means that Hashem just blocked it out, ignored, tuned it out. It's not that Bilam is wrong and there's a winning response to slug up, to destroy Bilam's argument. That there's a tshuva nitzachas mitam v'das hamusag umuvan. No. She'ein mekabel and v'shemin is the word of klal b'li tam v'das. If a Bilam shows up with a kitrug, the Eibishter, the lesson here is that if a Bilam shows up, then you have to tune them out, you have to cover your ears and not listen and ignore. B'li tam v'das, even if technically, objectively, the Bilam is more correct, is more accurate in what he's diagnosing and describing, that's the v'loi ava. Why? The chol kach lama, and favas so it says, Hashem alekacha, because Hashem is alekacha, and every yid, there's a ha'ar of Hashem, and then it goes off and turns into a more traditional, conventional Maimer of the Alter Rebbe. It starts with about how every Yid has a tivis, which also is sort of emphasizing the mile of a Yid, which is something that Alter Rebbe mentions a lot, which is that really the Inyan of a Yid is not to be disconnected, and if there's an Aveda, it's just a Ruach Shtos. It's eingenait that is Eidena B'Yadusa, but really a Kal Shebekalim is Meisei Nafsha Kiddush Hashem. Every time the Alter Rebbe says Kal Shebekalim, Meisei Nafsha Kiddush Hashem, that's also like a Melitz Yeshur, or Levi Yitzchak Barditch of being Malamed Tzchos. Why is the Alter Rebbe going out of his way to say this so many times? Haguf is a limud tzchos of the Alter Rebbe that even a Kal Shebekalim is really such a great person. Nachmas Teva Nafshay, Elamai, it's Mesuteres, Mechusa, Belavush Sak, but if you're Ma'er the Ava, etc., etc. Of course, it's not just a feel-good mimer. The mimer continues along regular lines, and it's Mont and Aveda, and from the Hemshach of the mimer, it's mashma that the B'lei Ava comes from our work on our end. There's Aveda, it's not just get out of jail free card. But the beginning of this mimer, L'chayra, the L'shainis, the signet is very powerful, very special, very unique, and that's why it's worth calling it out, worth emphasizing its Stangzich on it, and that's what we did here so far. I think we mentioned earlier, there's also a Hanoch of the Mittel Rebbe in Tavkov Samach Vav, and there's one of the lines there is a bit stronger, a bit clearer, that gets at what I was saying, that the Alter Rebbe is making a more general statement here. It's not just a technical zach about Mekatrigim Lamaila and about Bilam, but this is actually a general statement of a Shita. So I have the text here with me. I sent you the text as well. So the relevant passage about Bilam towards the beginning is that what's Bilam? What's the story of Bilam? All the details, the story of Bilam, the whole plot of the story of Bilam is that there's l'chapis v'limtzei makim l'katrig al Yisrael. He's trying the whole time. He's trying to find a place to stand, and so he was big ma'ayin in the avedus of the Yidden and trying to find the right place to be able to convey that. The way it says it there is, he adds v'chol mi shemechapes limtzei kitrig al Yisrael nikra b'shem Bilam. So there, it's like that line is a little starker, a little clearer. Yeder einer, anyone who's zucht kitrugim an Yidden. Right, they're ungerufen on Bilam. And that's what Bilam did. Bilam was chapis b'chol mekaymis, and here again it lifts, it rattles off the places, Reisha Pa'er, etc., etc., Vayoshes Salamid Barpanav, etc. And here, in the Mittel Rebbe's order of Inyanim, here he mentions V'lachach, Noitam, Rosh Hashana, Shefer, Litzkaya, Kadei la'arbi v'sam mekatrig sheb'chol der l'chapes l'ilmeit choyva al Yisrael shenikra Bilam. So every Rosh Hashana we take a shefer to confuse the mekatrig of every dar. So there's always a mekatrig, and that mekatrig needs to, as we say in English, the Rebbe once said it in the Farbrengen, so we could say it here, we have to shut him up. In order to shut up the mekatrig, so that's with the shefer.
The Rebbe said it about the mekatrig?
No, the Rebbe once said it in the Farbrengen. That was, I don't remember. The Rebbe said the Lashon, shut up, in one Farbrengen. Growing up, it was like in Nishta Edel Lashon, you don't use it stamazai, you don't scream at someone, but to use it as b'derech agav in a specific context, we learned that apparently you can use it. So when we're talking about a mekatrig l'mayla, you can say to shut up the mekatrig. I think is appropriate, is okay. So I think in the Mittel Rebbe's Lashon, there's just a bit more of that like idea that it's a general clout, a general yisoid. A mekatrig is a bilam. And we also have this from the Mittel Rebbe in his own Lashon as a Maimon Mittel Rebbe, Memorial Admar Mtsoe, Parshas Teitzei, Barucha, Dir Maschel V'Le'ava, but I looked it up, I didn't see that there was any additional kvetch and knetch on this Nakodas. I'm not going to quote it additionally, but you can look it up if you want to see it in the Mittel Rebbe's Arichastike Sprach. So I want to, I haven't quoted that, I want to elaborate both a little bit on the general idea of Keturah and Rosh Hashana. So like I said, for some people maybe it needs to come as a reminder that this is part of everyone's Judaism, part of our Judaism, and this is definitely part of how we think about Rosh Hashana, that our Keturah and our Mekatrigim, and Chas v'Shalom, there have been years in the past that there weren't such good years, and those good years, the good years affect everybody, they're not such good years affect everybody. We're all hoping to have a good year. Torah says that this is decided on Rosh Hashana, and it's decided based on a variety of factors, and that's why we daven, and that's why we blow shofar, and that's why we hope to have, and that's why we wish each other so much from Chamisha Asar B'Av and through Rish Chodesh El. Obviously, we care very much that it should be a good year, and it's not just something we ignore and tune out. The whole Elul, it's maybe for other people it's 75, 85, 100% of their Elul and Tishrei. Maybe for us it's 25% of Elul and Tishrei. Hopefully, we're focusing more on Hecher Zachen, but it's definitely an important component. So that's part of what we're, like I said, there's like two halves to the point here. I guess you could say half of it is directed inward at ourselves to get it straight, and half of it is directed outwardly at those that maybe have a kitra problem.
I think that Bechlal is all of these type of things that Chabad emphasized less are at least in the original intent was to focus more, like you say, on Hecher Zachen. And like sometimes, just another example, I believe I was Bechiach in the past without getting into all the rayas right now, that the reason why nowadays it's like a clear minhag Chabad, so to speak, and we don't say Slichas and Asayas Mitzvah, was because that was, that's the peak time of where you should be Oisik more in the Chassidus and Avodas Tefillah, etc. And not that, I'm potter, so I could go back to waking up half an hour later or whatever, but forget. So I think that's the same is true as many of these things, that to the extent that the hyper focus was tuned down somewhat, it's designed to be in the favor of being and not just to, we have less of a burden or whatever it is.
Right. So, like in short, Chassidus is never geireya, never takes away and gives a discount, and as they say in Ivrit, a hanacha, of making it easier. Like you say, oh, now you can get up later. It's only to add that why be on a nidrik madrega when you can be on a hachan madrega. Another example of this is maybe zmiris by this of the Shabbos. That okay, zmiris is a zach, but it could be better things. You could be talking about Chassidus, you could be singing nagunim. But if you take away the zmiris and then so the Shabbos is just whatever, then probably would be better off with the zmiris. So yeah, like you say, the same goes for slichas. Even not being noyeg to do slichas so early, right? I think slichas in 770 lefi erech is later compared to most places, but it's Stam the Chassidus comes before the slichas, or whatever the seder is, as opposed to just an invitation to be more relaxed. Yeah. So b'negayat ketrukim and Rosh Hashana. So my urge, my instinct would be when I was looking into this now to go through the whole Chassidus to find every place where it says Kitrug, Rosh Hashana, Mekatrig. There's different forms of the word, right? This is another search tip, right? How do you search Netzer Chachmi? You have to search Mekatrig, Mekatrigim, Kitrug, Kitrugim, Kategar, right? So that's at least 5 different terms. And then Rosh Hashana, is it 2 words? Is it Rosh Tevis? So the more you expand your search, the more results there are. We don't have time. I didn't even have time to go through them. But I found one interesting place. Tzemach Tzedek in a few places brings a few Marmakamis, but I found the Rebbe Marash, probably based on a Tzemach Tzedek, in Tafish Lamed Aleph, Chelik Beis, towards the end of Tak of Lamed Aleph, has a Maimer Atam Yitzavim that begins off with a shtickle birur b'negeh the Kitrugim and Rosh Hashana. B'chal, there's a sugi in Chassidus about the Yom Adin of every day compared to the Yom Adin of Rosh Hashana. The whole Kuntres Hamayin, you learn it. It's usually part of the curriculum in Masifta to learn Kuntres Hamayin. A big chunk of Kuntres Hamayin is up to a whole Shaklavatari about the Yom Adin. Speaking of the Inyan of Yom Adin, it's very central to Kuntres Hamayin. And how does it shtim? The Makaitis and the Chazal about the Yom Adin every day versus the Yom Adin of Rosh Hashana. So there's a version of this here as well. Here it's about Atam Yitzavim, and Atam Yitzavim is Hayyim, and what's Hayyim? Hayyim refers to Rosh Hashana. So Eov is, of course, the big relevant source, and Eov is the one place in Tanakh where it says V'yavoyu b'nei elikim liyisiyatziv Yavi hasatan b'soicham, and the Chazal say that's referring to Rosh Hashana. So that whole visual of the Satan and the Mekatrigim, the Makar, the earliest Makar is in this the introduction to Eov, where the Mekatrig on Eov, and then Eov has a bit of a rough time, etc. Even if those who haven't learned Eov should hopefully be familiar with the at least the beginning and the end. So that comes from there, and that's being quoted here. When Chassidus wants to get into some of the Marmakaimis, so it's quoting these Makaitis from Eov. So getting into this idea that Rosh Hashana is Taka the Yom Adin, based on this pasuk in Eov, and there's a din every day, but Rosh Hashana is the din Rabbah. Rosh Hashana is the main Yom Adin. I think in Kutus Hamayin, the way it's explained is that the Iker din, the Shefa for the whole year, is Nikba on Rosh Hashana. But then every day there's like a mini din on the Shefa for that day. That's like the pshat of the Tivuch. In order to appreciate what the Kutus Hamayin is saying, it probably helps to look at the Gemaras and the Rishonim to understand what the different Havanas in the Indian work could be. The Bisman Rishonim, there wasn't such a clear Havana exactly in how these Makaitis add up, and that's why Chassidus keeps on going through it over and over again, because the Taka needs to be clarified. It'd be interesting to look into that as its own separate topic. It's not where I'm coming from right now. Just being aware that if Kutus Hamayin is devoting pages to it, it's clearly a sugya gufa in Chazal and Rishonim. So here the Rebbe seems to be kvetching that Rosh Hashana is a dinner Rabbah, and that's from the Targum of Eov. It says V'hav b'yem the dinner Rabbah the Rosh Hashana. So meduyek stimmt that Rosh Hashana is the dinner Rabbah. There's also a Tikkun Zohar, and there are mentions about how the Malachim came and said Ma enesh kisiskerenu or Ma adam batei de'ehu. So the Rebbe says essentially that was the first kitrug, right? When Hashem created man, right before man did anything, nothing even happened yet. There was the biggest kitrug of all. The biggest kitrug of all was saying, "Don't do it. Don't create man." So you see this pattern of kitrug goes all the way back, and that was also Doch Rosh Hashana, Chafei Be'el Niver Olam. Rosh Hashana is Yom Shishi. So the day of first Rosh Hashana, the time that there was any talk of humans, Rosh Hashana B'rias Olam, right away they were makaterik Mo'adam Tedeyu, Ma'anish Kisis Kerenu. Yeah, the whole B'rias Olam is B'shvil Adam, because it's the Meach is B'shvil Adam, the Chai and Dam, and even the Shkatzim and Ramasim. Everything Epis has a shaykhus to a person, whether it's something positive or whether it's a negative. It's a leisasa. Every single aspect, or maybe that he adds, maybe they're part of the ecosystem, maybe they're highest tmeis that yesh tzrichim le'ezu pu'ula begashmius b'mkaimas hachamim sheshama dureim. So maybe it's not only just through the prism of mitzvahs and isurim. Maybe they just serve a purpose in the world's ecosystem, which is definitely something we have a more complex understanding of today. So nimtza ke'akol b'shvil adam. So they weren't mekaterig. The kittug didn't have to be on all the other things. The kittug is directly on the other because that's really the point of it all. So ikar kittug hoya b'vriyas adam. So this is the ur kitrug from the very beginning, and then every Rosh Hashanah it's sort of a reminder, a refresh. Wait a second, why did we create man again? Let's justify that budget expenditure again. Let's justify that project again. Explain why we need to do this. So b'tchilas b'riyas adam rishon there was a kitrug klali and klolas habriya of kol shis alfishni. And then every year, weiter there's a dinner mishpat on the highest shefa of the new year. It's like a mini beginning of, just like the beginning of the world was the beginning of the world. So Rosh Hashana is the beginning of the year. Befrat. So just like there was a kitrug klali then, so there's a kitrug prati every year. Borm l'isyatzim al Hashem, the lashon aniv. And then weiter, that means every mini kitrug, every mini din. We talk about there's a din b'chol yom or b'chol shah. So l'chayr is also mitzad the kitrug, I think is what he's saying. And Ayin Sham, he gets into this is sort of the presentation there. We don't have time to go through every little line there, but he's like framing it like this is like the narrative of like the whole story of creation, the whole story of man from day one is that there are the naysayers, the naysayers Lamaila that are saying that tzarachin of the ganze Zach. So that happened on a very large scale. By the way, this reminds me that I have to remind myself the pratim. But recently we were talking about my top shiurim, or the most interesting ones. So one of them was about no more massacres, which there are some things I recorded that I mamish have to go back and reread and re-listen. But I think one of the yisaidis in that talk, if you look in the earlier Makaidas to talk about this inyan, was that I have to remind me, but there was definitely this line there about how there's like maybe the Yom Hadin at the end is like the Yom Hadin klali of the whole, like the reverse version of this. Like there's like the mini Yom Hadin, and then you get to the Yom Hadin Agad Levaner at the end, and that's on klolos kol shizal fishni, something like that. Gotta go check that up again. So it's like the same pattern, but here it's being stated in the reverse. It's kitrug klali was b'shas b'riyas adam. And then every time after that, there's like an echo of that kitrug that back then, and then they come again, they taina again. And therefore he says though, the Eibusher was already doiche the kitrug, and they're coming and bringing it up again. That's why it's li'siyatziv al Hashem. It's a shtickle chutzpah. They're starting up with the Eibusher. The Eibusher already was machriya that the kitrug is ishkan kitrug, and every year they come back again, and they nudge about it again. So now it's already a shtickle chutzpah. So that's why it's le'siyatziv al Hashem. It's nechshav ki'ilu him toyanim negdei yispar. Like I said, it's a very interesting sugi. You could just take that excerpt from that mimer and learn it. It's almost very nigladic, like a drush being mevarer pratim in the kitrug haklal, the kitrug haprati, etc. And ultimately, he says there, the point of the kitrug is also the Chassidus, you have to explain that the kitrug is always to accomplish something greater, to get to something better. So, being Mekatzi here, but that's the so Ayidei HaKitrug B'Shebechol Shana Ayidei Sheboim B'nei Elikim Lis Yatziv Ayidei Zenimshech B'Bchina Hagavoya Yoser. So this is also an important part of it, important component that Chassidus we always like to emphasize. That, like in this example, we're saying that the taka is a kitrug, but what's the point of it? It's always for a positive. Every negative thing, there is no negative. So an oynish, well, maybe we'll see later, an oynish is always for a positive thing. So even the kitrug is also ultimately for a positive thing. Doesn't mean that we're pro-kitrug. It just means that if the Eibishter set it up that way, obviously it doesn't tell us. But afal pikein, obviously we want to be memayit as much as possible in the kitrug itself. So that's that. I think the kitzer. We'll leave it at that. And Ayin Sham, like I said, it's Atam Nitzavim, Tafresh Laman Aleph, Chelik Beis of Tafresh Laman Aleph. Yeah. So that's. I think that we'll leave it at that. Benegea to the Indian of Kittur, Mekatrigim, Kateg, Rosh Hashana. Like I said already, but the Rebbe spoke about it less. B'chulu, but I don't think that's really to take away from it. And it's still part of the chinuch. Like I said, certainly for children. It's still, the stories are told to children in Bechlal, like we were talking about earlier, about imagination, and picturing things, and that, especially as a shaykhis to children. And that's part of how Malamed's job is described, that he's supposed to sort of ignite the imagination of the children. And that's all like a fair part of chinuch. And then as the person grows up, so hopefully there's a more mature version and understanding of the Inyan, and that doesn't remain at a first grade level. And again, that's maybe sometimes why people have a problem with some of the people out there that talk about this stuff, because from our perspective, it could be this Farana an emes in them, but it's on a first grade level, and maybe it's time to grow up. So that's about that. Now to move on to the other Nakud, like I just said, about not being Mekatrig and Yidden. So here in B'lei Ava, it's Azoi B'Merumaz, it's not Azoi B'Fedish. But there are other places where the Alter Rebbe says it more clearly, more B'Fedish. One of them is elsewhere in Likutei Torah. This is Havai Yechatu Merivov in Likutei Torah, Parshas Nosei. So this was not said because of the Parshas Nosei. This was actually said Yom Shabbos, Parshas Vayetze, Tavkuf Samachay. And actually, if you look here in B'lei Ava, if you look all the way at the end of the beer, which we didn't even get into, the end of the beer, the Tzemach Tzedek is talking about Tzayin. Ayim Mashal as well, Malkam Acher, Al Pasuk, Havaya Yechatu Merivov. And as we'll see, in Havaya Yechatu Merivov, the Tzemach Tzedek is Mitzayin back to B'lei Ava. So these two Mamarim are connected, not just because I noticed a common theme, but because the Tzemach Tzedek already pointed it out. I noticed that the Tzemach Tzedek pointed it out after I noticed the connection, whatever my process was. But then I noticed the Tzemach Tzedek himself has been signed from each one to the other. So this is printed.
Somewhere this week that by the Tzemach Tzedek being Nesasik and being Nesadr all of my Marim.
Right. So it's in the Likutei Torah Nasa. It starts Ksiv Havai Yechatu Merivov. Now, where's this pasuk from? It's the end of Tfilas Chana, the beginning of Sefer Shmuel, beginning of Perek Beis. She says her tefillah concludes Hashem Yechatu Merivov, Olav Bashamayim, Yarim Hashem, etc. Ends off Yitno Iz Lamalka V'Yarim Karim B'Shichai. And this is the Haftarah of Yom Aleph to Rosh Hashana. So, weiter, this is in Likutei Torah Nasa, but actually it's connected to Rosh Hashana. The Alter Rebbe shtang sich on this pasuk from the Haftarah of Yom Aleph to Rosh Hashana. So, Yechatu Merivov, Hashem apparently is in a fight with someone. He has Merivov, Kasha. Miheim, HaMeriv B'M Hashem. Right? So who's fighting with the Eibishter? Miheim, HaMeriv B'M Hashem. Weiter, he says, again, we're not going to get into the whole binyan of the whole Maimer, but weiter, he says that if you have pure Gvura that's not Klula B'Chesed, like an Elam HaToyu, where you don't have Lachlala Smala B'Yamina, so then you can have Din and Kashem. And the manifestation of Din and Kashem is, Hey, HaMekatrigim Shalamayla, Shakol Ritzoinam Lif Oil Din. What's a Mekatrig? A Mekatrig is, his whole Zach is, he wants to see Din. That's what his whole existence is about. It's signed to a Zayar. And the Alter Rebbe adds, V'chen yesh lamata b'vnei Adam. Tishnar azach that exists lamayla. You also have it down here, lamata, yesh lamata b'vnei Adam, anashim hasmeichim b'ras chavireim. You have people, if you could believe it, that Pashat are happy, they enjoy when other people have it bad. And even sometimes when they are like masking it, they're expressing it as like anger towards the sinner, right? They're standing up for what's right, and they're against sin, and they're against the sinner. So it sounds good, it looks good. It's not that the chait really bothers them. It's, they like judgment, they like negativity, they like hurt, they like pain, and they sense it here. They have a shmek, it smells like there's something here, and they get drawn to that. And this is obviously a larger point. It's not only in a religious context. You just have people that are drawn to negativity. Today we have a mustic of social media. Social media has an algorithm. We know that the algorithm often is designed to amplify negativity, to amplify negative feelings, to encourage people to express negative feelings. Right? Obviously, negativity is a force in this world, even on that level. Never mind, you could take something more extreme like ISIS, where they were doing extremely horrible things, examples of din and einish, and that also was drawing people's attention, and they were doing it for attention. So obviously, in this world, even on a very basic human level, we know that negativity draws attention. And in interpersonal relationships, right, you'll have people that say, okay, I'm getting all the negativity out of my life. I'm going to stay away from negative people. I'm only going to surround myself with positive people. So this is something that people understand, many people understand on an instinctive level, that there's good energy, there's bad energy. This is something that I think doesn't need to be proven. Most people are masking that this exists in one way or another. So here you see the Alter Rebbe saying this in a more ruchnistic oifen. Obviously, from a ruchnistic perspective, Chabad perspective, all good is about the Eibishter and seeing the Gilui of Alikos, the Gilui of the Eibishter in this world. And the idea of punishment is sort of a byproduct. It's a necessary thing. The Eibishter created it because it needs to exist. But if that's the thing that you're getting all excited about, so Kenish Zayin, that it's coming from caring about the Eibishter, having a koch in the Eibishter, clearly it's coming from Epis Ashlachtskait. And that the Eibishter built into this world, all the way up from the Mekatrigim and the Malach Chabal Lamaila, that a certain percentage of the universe is dedicated to bad, to negativity, to inflicting harm and pain, even if it's for the good cause. But to be the one to inflict the harm, to inflict the pain, or to root for it, to be happy for it, is very problematic. And this is something, I definitely see examples of this even in everyday situations. Right, a person that works as a jailer, a person that works even in law enforcement, if your job is to give out tickets, I'm not saying that it's bad and should be abolished. We're not coming out here with an abolish the police platform, even though we just came off of Sheftim B'Sheitrim, and someone pointed out that the Rebbe talks about abolishing Sheitrim, Geula. Fine, we're not getting into. We're not saying there's no need. There's a need for din. There's a need for einish. It's hard we can't live in a world without din and einish. But the people that have to actually carry it out, it's a little hard to understand what kind of person that is that can do that, can carry, especially when a lot of the din and the einish is not done in a just oifen, and there's a lot of unnecessary suffering. So what kind of person is that's involved in that? So that's something that I think about. Or even you read it in the news, you read that so and so did kach v'kach and got a punishment, or so and so did kach v'kach, and then people comment and they say, "Oh, this person deserves punishment." To me, it never sits fully well with me, even though I'm very very against people doing bad things. But when it gets to the part of, okay, so we have to punish them, it actually always does not sit well with me. That's probably why I wouldn't be able to serve on a jury, because it's hard to be the one to say, okay, I'm right. This Lamaila, who is the one that paskins sometimes in the Beis Din Shamayla, the way it's described is that you have either Malachim, Lutziyeshim, Malachim Chabal on the Beis Din Shamayla, or you have some stories. It's like there are tzaddikim on the Beis Din Shamayla, and this tzaddik, there's a story of Michal Zlotchev. Michal Zlotchev is on the Beis Din Shamayla, but the Michal Zlotchev doesn't have a musig of people's struggle with Averis, so Avadi is going to paskin L'choiva. So maybe that's where we have to replace him on the Beis Din Shamayla. Obviously, even with the Michal Zlotchev, right? There's a story even down here, right? There's a story about how he gave a person a very harsh tikkun tshuva, and then Michal Zlotchev himself was punished for giving him a harsh stick and shuva, and that's the moral of the story, that he has to be more understanding, and that's like a Baal Shem Tov story. So there's this strain, there's this channel, there's this current of thought where it's like, how could you be the one to inflict pain? How could you be the one to decide to inflict pain on someone? So that's, I mean, is that coming? Does that mean that it's coming straight from Kedusha when I think that? I don't know. Whatever. That's my own cheshbon nefesh to figure out where my ideas and thoughts and shittas are coming from. But I do think there's a bit of an alignment, a bit of a parallel between that way of thinking, that line of thought, and with what we're saying here. And I think it's very interesting, and maybe it's not a coincidence that when you see the Rebbe talking about jail, there's always this apprehension. The Rebbe never embraces it. There's the sikh where the Rebbe said it's b'chlal not in Yin Torah, and then they came to the Rebbe and said, what do you mean? There's all these makaritas about it. And the Rebbe said, yeah, but it's not really, at least the Einish Misa, at least it's mamash, it's like an Inyan Torah, the mamash is a te'eles, that it helps a person's neshama, right? So like we're saying over here, all the dinim in Lamaila have a te'eles. Like jail Kamal like doesn't have that te'eles in Kedusha. It's like just like a technical thing that you need to do if you need to do it. And it comes up in different sikhs where it sounds like the Rebbe wants to move to some kind of justice system where we're not penalizing people in this way. We're not just locking people. How the Rebbe holds that everyone has a purpose and something to contribute to the world. So you lock someone away, you're not allowing them to contribute what they need to contribute. Obviously, again, depends if are they a menace to society. It's hard, some people, the people being locked away seem like Malachi Kabbalah, like you're locking the Malach Kabbalah away from hurting other people.
It's within Shmira, not within Einish.
Right, but I'm saying this idea where this apprehension of the Rebbe is coming, it seems to be rooted in these larger ideas about good and evil, about chesed and din. If you fully subscribe to these ideas, then you can't just be out there following the news and rooting for hurt, for harm, for punishment. And as we'll see later, the last thing I have lined up here, the Rebbe even has this alashon, even mechablim, which when the Rebbe says mechablim, usually in that context it has a very specific connotation. Where mechabel is used has been used in Hebrew for the last many decades. So we're not going to get totally into the whole topic of Yisrael, and on the one hand, the Rebbe has obviously has a shita that's considered to be pretty, what's the word I'm looking for? Not just conservative, but hawkish, a very hawkish shita on security, which comes along with a lot of inflicting pain and harm and damage. And yet, even in that context, there are a few places where the Rebbe seems to show rachmanis and show mercy and l'shavas yitzara, and it all seems to be flowing from the same, so you can just look at it as, here's an interesting sikha, here's an interesting thing the Rebbe said, why did the Rebbe say that? But it's all flowing from this general mahalach, that you have to have a loving, benevolent feeling for everyone and for everything in God's creation, and even if someone's doing bad and harm and terrible things, so fine, there's a dysfunction here. There's a dysfunction that needs to be fixed. But it's not just about a round of recrimination. Okay, this person did something bad to me, so I'm going to do something bad to him. You have also this idea that you have to assume that it just came to Lamaila and that person was Nebuch HaShliach, but it's not really them that did it. There's so many different versions of these ideas of how it's not about just getting dragged into a round of recrimination. So I'm saying, if you sit and you learn sikhs and this and that, and then you just go and what I used to be listening to the radio. I assume that's a bit out of style by now. Whatever it is that people get their stuff from, and if it's appealing to that side of a person, if it's being more, whether it's again social media, the algorithm now is also a big part of it. If it's appealing to that side of a person, that's like the Malach Kabbalah side of humanity. That's the Malach Kabbalah side of existence. That's not a part of existence that we want to be focusing on and dwelling on. That's the part we want to suppress, you could say, or transform. So I think that's all. So this is you could say. Well, there's always the conundrum. I remember joking about this back in yeshiva. If you criticize someone for being mekaterig, so you're being mekaterig on the mekaterig. So who guards the guards? Who's mekaterig?
I was having that thought a minute ago as you were saying. Yeah.
So it's always okay, but you see, Chassidus does it. So obviously, Canada there's an art to call out the mekaterig. But yeah, I have to also be careful not to be mekaterig too much on those that are nikshel bedakos and being mekaterig. But yeah, we all have to be sensitive. in our own way. If I came out and I said that anyone who thinks that someone else deserves jail, I would have to really check myself. Why it sounds like I'm doing the same thing. I didn't go that far. So here you have this line, Bekitzer, it's a beferish that even you think you're standing up for justice, for the right thing, it's nicht azoi. It's just Schlachtskeit. The Alter Rebbe adds, and the same thing goes for the Mekatzigim Lamaila. You think the Mekatzigim Lamaila, they mamish care some? He says, Eino mitzvara me'achetz. Not the Kinnas Hashem tzvahs. They're programmed for din. They're programmed for death, for negativity, for punishment. They're just Siga Hagvura, that's how they're programmed. So if you see anyone acting that way, okay, this is like today with automation, we might soon have death robots, right? Robots that are programmed, or even have drones at this point. You have death drones. So you have Malach Kabbalah, there are death drones. You have human death drones. You have things that are programmed to rain death down on people, on existence. That's ultimately that they all have the same thing in common. They all are the baser, worse, the negative part of our instincts of humanity, of reality. That's why they're called Merivav. They're called Merivav because Havaya is Chesed. If your Inyan is punishment, then you're Merivav. Then you are an enemy of the Eibishter. That's what the Alter Rebbe says here. And then a bit weiter there, the Alter Rebbe says you need to be Mamshech Chesed Da'arech Ampin. And then you get rid of all the bad. Because Chesed Dezah, the regular Chesed, that's Lefi Erech Ma'aseh B'nei Adam. Still Satus, still Eila, and so the Chesed is B'gvul Mida, and Al Kain Sham Moitzim HaMekatrigim Mokim Lekatrig U'Kamoi Bilam. So here you see the Bilam connection as well. Bilam gets invoked to that. That's a Bilam, and right, the Bilam was Chipes, Umatzah, Mekimis, like Dezer Ratza Lekatrig, Lamed Choyvel, Ermid. So you mamish see how the two Torahs are very connected. They both have this word about Bilam. So you need the Chesed Darech Ampen, the Chesed Ilah. And weiter, and the Alter Rebbe concludes, and then when you have this Hamshachim, this Batam Kol Adinim, Ve'ena Ketrugim Teifsim Makim Klal, so and then you have, and everything's great, which is weiter. So you see the Rebbe's signon of it's like almost like the Alter Rebbe's been Me'oyer that Azoizel Zayin, that Shemamshich from the ultimate Chesed, and then there are no Dinim, there are no Ketrugim. That's the ultimate thing that we daven for, that we hope for. And then here the Tzemach Tzedek is Mitzayim. I am Mashin is Bar Al Pasuk. So here you see the connection between the two places. It's another hanacha of this Havai Yechatu from Vayete Tavkov Samachei that's printed in Sefer Tavkov Samachei. But there's a Dvar Pella, there's a Pella that not only once that year did the Alter Rebbe say a Torah, a Maimer, a Sicha on Havai Yechatu with this Teichen, but if you keep turning the pages there, like 150 pages later in Tavkov Samachei, there's another Dibra Maschol Havai Yechatu, and it appears in the Sefer and in the Ksav Yad that it was taken from after the Mamar of Parshas Boi. So it seems like a few months later, the Alter Rebbe returned to this Inyan again, Parshas Boi, and again said a Torah, a Sicha that begins with Havai Yechat of the same pasuk, and both times the pasuk had no direct connection to that time. It wasn't like a drush, an official drush on the parsha. That's why I think it's more like a Sicha. And this was printed before the Amari Admar Azak, and this was already printed also in the Sefer Meah She'arim, printed 100 years ago, that different short Torahs of the Alter Rebbe. So it seems like it's like a different drush. And there, the Alter Rebbe says, it's mamish even more focused just on this Inyan. Vayechat Merivav, we know that Merivav are the Mekatzkim Lamaila, they're the Merivav Shel Havaya. And Alter Rebbe says, the Koima Shlema, like this whole universe, this whole ecosystem, this whole spiritual ecosystem of Chitzoinim, Klippus, the Katrigal Yisrael, Dafka B'yem Adin, again Rosh Hashana gets emphasized, Dafka B'yem Adin Rosh Hashana, Shinidin Ha'olam, so there's a Pischem Peh, a Pischem Peh, Baldin, the Katrig, and Lovakish Din, all over the Ritzoinim. So Hashem created this whole ecosystem. Why does this ecosystem exist? Why does Hashem generate this whole thing? Hashem Oyev Mishpat. Mishpat Ole Kim Hu. There is a union of din. Ladun Oyser B'din Ha'amiti, to punish for being over. Tzachar Toiv La'Oyser Tzayne. But the Eibush is a Makar Toiv V'Chesed V'Chayim Toiv V'Meitiv L'Koil L'Ram V'La'Toivim B'Shav Mamish. The Eibush himself Kivayachol can't be the Baal Din that's Teveya B'Mishpat of the Evi Aveda, because Hashem is the Makar Toiv V'Chesed La'Yagim Gurei Rachas V'Shalom. Here's like the Alter Rebbe is like mamish, Tanya Alter Rebbe says in Raya Melamayla. Here the Alter Rebbe is like very directly like explaining the system.
Oh,
I.
Ein Rai Yored Milmailo is hunting the Chitas of tonight, the Shirtanya tomorrow is Laskil Chabino.
Right. So, Mamash Azman Grama Mekamat Stodim. So, the Mishpat and Din is also the Midas Chasta of the Eibishter, it's the Tevasai, for the Yisurim, for the Tshuva Shlema, etc. It's a Tevik Gdoila, Chesed Gadol, Malakut Zachen. It says, and that's why Taka, it's only for Yidden. Yidden Taka only get the Inshim. Umas Oilam, Loich Beslei Klal, even if they're over the Rebbe Zora, Eina Makatik, Rosh Hashana, Raka Yisrael Bavad, very interesting line there. Because it's chesed, so only Yidden are zeicha to this chesed. Only we are zeicha to the Geshmak Inyan of Kitrugim and Einshim, which itself is a beautiful perspective. It gives you a certain perspective.
Where is it on the paper? I printed out the paper also. Where's that line?
What are you looking?
The line that you just read.
It's at the beginning of a new page. The dibur is Afal Pikain. The line before Afal Pikain, 2 lines before it is that it's Dafka outs the love to the Yidden in Manishim Ka'avas Ben. Umas O'il Moichmas like Klau, Afshem Rev David Zara, In Makater Rosh Hashana, Raka Yisrael Bovad Mitam Hanal. Which also almost sounds a little bit like a limud schos. Anumas O'il, or like being Malamed, like at least schos b'parel mamish. They shouldn't be punished for anything because it's Dishnageh anyway. So why should they be punished? There shouldn't be any punishment. And we'll see at the end that Alter Rebbe says about Oiv David Zara. So it's not stam a word in passing. This is going to be neged to a point we're going to get to about not even being mekatrig on Umas Oilam. So the Alter Rebbe's version of that here is for them there's no kitrig milachatchila b'chlal. They're not even part of the picture. They're a different cheshbon. We're saying, oh, it's taiva.
On them. Well, okay, I'm not much following all the dots here, but at the end, the word at the end of Leila Katrig al Shum Adam, even on a nitiyid, how does that follow from this?
So I think he's foreshadowing it here by saying that, like, the Mekatrik doesn't even care on Rosh Hashana. The Mekatrik isn't, the whole Kitrik on Rosh Hashana Be'etzem is only connected to Yisrael. All the stories are Mekatrik ad Yidden. What about everyone else? It's a Yom for everyone, but Kitrik isn't on everyone. The Kitrik is only on Yidden. Why is Kitrik not on everyone? Because Eibishter doesn't...
The Noahites don't need to come to Shul on Rosh Hashana, you're saying, okay.
For that, they have to ask their local...
Yeah, I don't know if you have them in Crown Heights, but by us in the Gelilas, there's Noahites, yeah. Okay, right.
So they have to ask their local Noahide rabbi what the shita and ashkafa on that is. But here he says, right? So that's a defense of the whole system. It's a teva, it's a chesed, but alpha pk, it's a din and a oynesh. The Eibishter can't be the teveya. Only teva chesed. So therefore, he created this whole kema shlema of chitzonim, mekatrigim, teva mishpat. And then Hashem Layev Mishpat. So when they come, Eibishter responds, is done, v'shoifer oiseh b'dinu mishpat. Okay, so it sounds like a bit of a defense. And then the Alter Rebbe goes straight back and says, that's why it says, Hashem yechatu merivav. They are merivav mamish. They're mamish menaga to the Eibishter. It goes off into the whole thing about Achan, which is interesting itself. The Ma'aseh of Achan. Got the Taich's oyster story. I don't know if we're going to go through all of that, but the punchline is that there's a big problem. Achan caused this whole problem, and the Eibishter says to Moshe, says to Yeshua, what am I, someone that goes and is a malshin? Go figure it out. Make it all this. You'll figure it out. It's not mimidasish HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The Eibishter kenne sharei sagen a schlechte Zach. So you have to figure it out in the girdles of Ma'amanadas, and it's gonna source, it's gonna get the correct information. But Heidia Hakadosh Baruch Hu loy, there's 2 gersars, either befedish or befiv. Eibishter nishka can zagen. Obviously kaviyachol, everything's kaviyachol, but the Eibishter can't kaviyachol say it. It has to come through a girdle, b'meila, has to come from some other source of information. Even though b'mcha hakoil, obviously ultimately it comes from the Eibishter. but it was Nislabish and a Geidel, which is dafka in the structure of a male. So, like the Eibishter has to, just like today, in the world we are in today, sometimes the president, Lahavdil, needs something to happen, but it can't be directly from him. It has to happen as a Memela. So there's certain things the Eibishter needs to happen that aren't so positive, so it has to happen in the Memela de Goyf, and it can't be traced directly back to the Eibishter. Huh?
Nicht in mein Namen type of thing.
Yeah. So you see it, it's a midah from the Rebbe. You see it by the Rebbe and the Rebbe also sometimes can sein, that whatever, something negative has to happen, but it shouldn't come directly. So Al derech zeh, Rosh Hashana, the Samach Mem, the Mekatrig is Mekatrig. But that's klippus et achre. Kedusha leyager b'megurei ra chas v'shalom klal. So ultimately, like he just, after explaining why the whole thing is necessary, he immediately turns around and says, these are medivav mamish. And then the Alter Rebbe concludes, v'kach tzarech ha'adam ledabek b'midaisav. So if the Rebbe is azoi, so shit in Chazal, you have to be ledabek b'midaisav, mahu chanon v'rachum. V'loy lekatreg, here's the key line, v'loy lekatreg al shum adam af ha'ovdei aveidah zarah chas v'shalom. You shouldn't ever express a negative sentiment, whether it's a person's a bad person, or that a person deserves a punishment, on any person, af an ovdei aveidah zarah chas v'shalom. Ki kol ha'ketrugim v'hadinin, hu mesitra achra mari dedinin. The second you are saying a negative thing about a person, so you're on team Malachi Chabala, you're on team Sitra Achra. So yeah, the Rebbe created it, the Svarim described all Malachi Chabala and Sitra Achra, but if you're identifying with it, if you're channeling it, so now you're on team Sitra Achra, and you're on team Merivov, and you're on the opposite of team the Rebbe. Yeah, the Rebbe set this whole thing up, and it's important, we need to know the information, etc., but very, very cluttered, obviously nuanced Tashkafa here from the Alter Rebbe, explaining on the one hand why it's necessary, why the Eibishter created it and allows it to be. The Eibishter has a side of being done, but for this to exist, you have to be azoi up-considered from the Eibishter. You have to be so disconnected from the Eibishter that you're klippe of such a achra mamish. And anyone who identifies with that is unfortunately in the same. That's why the Alter Rebbe says you can't be makatrig al shum adam even on ovdei aveidah zarah, which is a very very expansive and shocking is the right word, but a very strong statement. It's not very well known. I mean, you can search this phrase. It's not a velt bavusta phrase, so it's I think it's a good idea that we're platforming and elevating it because it's a very cluttered writer. And he adds v'zeh nikra Moitzi Shamra al derech emes v'dal. Like b'pnimius, Moitzi Shamra is this Inyan. So I guess we can be ma'ayin in that and unpack that a bit. But anyone who goes around expressing bad things about people, I guess especially if it wasn't fully stated before and it's said in a bad and negative way, so Moitzi Shamra is obviously could just be a social thing, and it's just talking about the Shloyo Moitzi Shamra al Meisim. That's brought in Shulchan Aruch Chedem HaKadmonim, which is
I was gonna bring that up because you maybe talk most of the bdichas, not in the joke, but just in terms of something lighter moment. Maybe you want to do a little bit of a brief overview of what the Chedem HaKadmonim is.
If you think we should mix it in here, okay. So there's the Shulchan Aruch Mechaber
later.
No, I mean I wasn't planning on mentioning it later.
You posted on your status earlier this week, but maybe you could flesh it out a little bit. What exactly the Medrash is saying and how that leads down to the famous thing. Right.
So the Nekuda is that the Mechaber brings a Bekitzer in Shulchan Aruch that there's kind of a Chedem HaKadmonim Shloyo Moitzi Shamra al Meisim, which is still somewhat known, gets invoked here and there, although today it's often hard to know exactly how to apply it. Sometimes a person dies b'shem toiv, and then there are some really terrible things that come out about them, so that being Moitzi Shamra al Meisim, what exactly is together. But B'chlal also, what Chedem HaKadmonim is an interesting lashon. So it's interesting, I was looking into the earlier sources to trace the idea. So the earliest sources are the Raviyah and the Ur Zarua. The Ur Zarua is quoting from the Raviyah. The way the Ur Zarua writes it, it's a very interesting oifen. I don't have the lashon in front of me, but the lashon is something like the minig in Rheinus in Western Germany, which is the source of Ashkenaz. The minig in Rheinus is or was to say that there is a Chedem HaKadmonim not to be Moitzi Shamra al Meisim. Like a very interesting lashon. Then it continues and says, yes, Taka Lama Ro al Kacha. And the answer is a medrash. I don't even remember the pratim of the medrash, but the interaction between Moshe and the Eibishter, Tarbus Anoshim Chatoim, and this is a lashon there that's just the people. We're only calling the people here Chatoim. We're not saying that they come from Zaydus of Chatoim, because then that includes Avram Yitzchak and Yaakov, and you're being Meitzah Shemanah, Avram Yitzchak. So that's sort of the mucker that you can't be. That's a medrash, so you can't be Meitzah Shemanah. So I said maybe Adar Chatzachos that this it's like a very unnecessarily heavy lashon. We're noyik to say when someone would be Meitzah Shemanah that there's a Cher Makadmonim. Why'd you say there's a Cher Makadmonim? The way Shulchan Aruch says it, Bekitzer. It almost sounds like it's a kvetch here, a kvetch. So I said, the kasha is, if it's a Cher Makadmonim, what's the Cher Makadmonim Amal had a specific connotation that the whole community came together and they made a takana on the pain of Cherem. So who, where is it? Cherem D'Mina Gershom? It's on the lists of Cherem D'Mina Gershom as far as I know. They're not mitzayin to that. So what's the what era is it from? What are the circumstances? So this whole notion of their minig was to say that there's a Cher Makadmonim sounds a little funny. So I said, there Chatzachos, at least, Lama Roa Kacha, maybe is a kasha not just on the Cher Makadmonim, but the kasha is on the people. Why were they noyik to say there's a Cher Makadmonim? And the answer is, because it's a medrash. So maybe the medrash is the Cher Makadmonim, because the medrash says what it says. So they used to say, Muslim Zagan, there's a Cher Makadmonim. If you look in the Ravya, it's a bit more bekitzer. Look in the Mordechai afterwards, it's also a bit more bekitzer. But even in the Mordechai, even I think a little in the Ravya, there's still a little bit of that Nagu, the Amru. There's like an extra kvetch there, which is interesting. But pshat-wise, from the context to look in the Marshal and other things, it seems like the Vart, also look in the Medrash, the Vart back then was more that when you get upset at someone and you scream at someone and you want to say, you're a chayta, to be makbid, not to say you and your father are chaytim, you and your zaydas, you come from a mishpach of chaytim, which is a sprach that people used to talk in. So the zahirus is not to just say that, throw that out there as an insult. That was the original pshat, as opposed to a specific expose coming out after someone's passing about bad deeds that he did. I don't think that's really strictly in that exact gather. I saw also the Yaakov Kamenetsky in his shiurim on in Emes Liakov. He says this line somewhere that he thinks is Stavka Mitzvah Shemra and Oshin Hara. But L'chera, specifically in the original context, Mitzvah Shemra Lamesim meant specifically as an insult. So when you insult someone, make sure to insult them personally, not to insult their family. That was the Mar Bechlal. Being Isaac in this Indian reminded me that today, L'chera, by most Yidden, I think the sprach has improved. We know what Amol in the Shtat, the people talking used to curse and call names and curse people's zaydas. L'chera today, it's a shtickle edel welt, and it's not as common. Recently there was a shtickle controversy, I don't want to get into it, but there was a controversy in the Chassidische world over a certain thing, and the family, a member of the family of those that felt affected, there was a message going around, people that have this tzara, and they listed a bunch of tzaras, a bunch of ancient. It said, don't be surprised, you do kach v'kach, and then this is what happens. And even that was jarring to hear, because I think in Chabad, I think we've pretty much successfully eradicated that type of sprach in Gansen. So to hear it from a Chassidish person, I think even in their world, it's not as common.
We just saw an example. Just because I'm Isaac in Bris Milah these days, I'll just read you an example I came across tonight from a God that came to from a letter of the Rebbe, that the Rebbe was writing to somebody about the Indian of the importance of Simcha by a bris, and he's mitzayin, as the Rebbe often does, the Munkachas for him. And over there, the Munkacha is writing about the people who don't make a proper Suda and a Yotze with just coffee and mazinus, and he says, and you see, people who did this, their sons and their daughters, you could see how far they went. And, there was that sprach, which was, I think, used to be much more common for people to sort of say, identify the correlation.
Right, and then the Munkacher himself, Bechlal, has a very sharp sprach, especially on things that he's upset about. Right, so so it's interesting to talk about the trays, especially in the world of Chassidus. But certainly in Chabad tradition, both B'Pel Mamish and what we see from the Rebbe, and both from what we see from the B'Kaitis here, we see that this is an idea with very strong roots in Chabad Torah. That goes all the way back to the Alter Rebbe. And so there's this line here that Meitzi Shemra al Derech Emes is to be mekatrik on someone, meaning Meitzi Shemra, the social ramifications of what you say, that's the pashita level. Mistam is the kavana. But the ikar in the Meitzi Shemra is that you're, and l'chayr connects to Hayem Yoim. The person said it'll be kareim kedog, and the Baal Shem Tov showed them that it's taka happening baruchnis. It sounds like the Rebbe is giving ramis to this. And when you're mekatrik on someone, so you're being Meitzi Shemra, a kind of primistic level, it's a very harmful thing. It's a very terrible thing, and that's like a klippe sitra achre dike zach. And then there's a fascinating line at the end. It says, "V'kayadua ha'maisa mimoyroi harav ha'magid demezrich shaloi rotzel lekalel basar v'dom." There's an article by Reb Nuchem Greenwald I was going to mention soon, but one of the things Reb Nuchem points out there is that how often does Alter Rebbe say "Kayadua ha'maisa"? We spoke last week about Hamelach Basada, that even a mashal of Hamelach Basada is a rare occurrence. It's like a B'derech Maisa, a little bit, Carter of L'derech Maisa, and even that's rare. So Hayadua HaMaisa is mamish very, very rare. Like I said, it's probably not a maim, it's probably a sicha. And I'm sure when the Alter Rebbe was Stam talking, I'm sure he mentioned the Maisa here and there. It's all there. It's all there in the Hanacha, whoever wrote it, either Ramesha, but whatever, whoever wrote it.
It's not, yeah. It could be the Alter Rebbe. It's Lavdafka part of the Lashon of the Alter Rebbe. It could be a Hisafa of the Maniach.
Seems unlikely.
It says Memoiroi, not Memoiri. Okay, whatever.
That's not, I don't know if that's a raya. The Alter Rebbe said it. So the Alter Rebbe mentioned that the Magen Bezich didn't want to curse. So we'll say in a minute what that is, because there's a discussion about what the story is referring to. But so the Vapalatik Azach, you have Avai Yechatu from Vayetze, you have Avai Yechatu from Parshas Boy, same pasuk, same teichen, like repeating, and this time, in the second time, even more like focused and concentrated, just on making the point that like bekender zagen a schlecht Wort. So what's going on? So I was thinking, and then I reminded myself that Reb Nuchem Greenwald wrote about this. Tafka Samachei was a very eventful year for the Alter Rebbe, because that year was the big machlekes between the Rav of Kalas and Eretz Yisrael and the Alter Rebbe, and there was a lot of lashon hara, Meitzi Shemra, machlekes, and historically, that's kind of the year when Chabad, today you look at Chabad, and Chabad's a little bit on the outs with the rest of the Chassidish world. It's sort of in its own lane, in its own category, with all the different ramifications of that. And l'chera, that sort of traces back with finality. I mean, it was going on for a few years, the Rav of Kalas, but it happened with finality in Tavkov Samachei. Up until then, in Eretz Yisrael, maybe we mentioned this, in Eretz Yisrael, in that region in Ukraine and White Russia, after the Maggid passed away, everyone, they were called Chassidim. There was the movement of Chassidim. Today we still use that, but then we give specific names. These Chassidim, those Chassidim. Back then it was the movement of Chassidim, Talmidei Rav Maggid, and they have a manig here, a manig. We spoke a little about this, a manig here, a manig there. And like we said, originally Eretz Yisrael was the headquarters, and White Russia is the satellite, and then after this Parsha, so for Chabad it switched. But in addition to that, this is in Eretz Yisrael, the group were called Chassidim, right? You had Chassidim, you had Prushim. Prushim are Talmidei Agra, and Chassidim are Talmidei Maggid. And all of a sudden, after this Tkufa, all of a sudden you have two groups in Eretz Yisrael. You have a group of Chassidim, and you have a group of Chabad. And people sometimes ask, what's the marker of the term Chabad? As far as I could tell, it seems like the term Chabad was invented or started being used in this time, in this context. It may have even been like a negative thing, like almost like a slur. Like, you're not Chassidim, you're Chabad. We see today, there are different, Chabad can be used as a shtickle. You can say Chabadsker, there's different ways of saying it in Oifen that show a little bit of disrespect. So it could be that it goes all the way back to using Chabad. And the only place Alter Rebbe refers to his people as Chabad is in one of the letters from this Tkufa, where he says that, in Eretz Yisrael they say that they don't want to have anything to do with Anoshim that are Mechunim Chabad. So that's where the term seems to have originated from. When they kicked the Chabad out, they said, you're no longer part of us, so we're not going to collect money from your people, we're not going to distribute the money, we're two separate kehillas now. So then all of a sudden there was Chassidim and there was Chabad. And there's letters from Chassam Sofer where he's very upset that there's this split, that there's Prushim, Chassidim, Chabad. He mentions Chabad there as well. Those were the original three groups. We know as time went on, each kollel kept on splitting and splintering a million times over, and B'chal, we live in a world now where every community is its own moistus. That all started for Chassidim. That started that Nekuda where Chabad got sort of booted from there.
I mean, there's another related topic which maybe we could put a mental note to make another recording about is the later history of the different geographical hispashtuses of Chassidus and how they do and don't relate to Chabad, etc.
Right. So back in White Russia, the split was a bit softer because by that point every group already had sort of their own manhigim and were minding their own business, and it's not like they were fighting for the same resources. The way in Eretz Yisrael, you're taking from the same kuppah, etc. So you don't find that there was as big a machlikas against the Alter Rebbe in his physical presence. And Rebbe Yitzchak Berditchev also stood up for the Alter Rebbe, defended the Alter Rebbe. Rav Kalis even wrote to Rebbe Yitzchak saying, "How you talking?" Apparently in Karlin also they were like annoyed that Rebbe Yitzchak was siding with the Alter Rebbe. That was a coup for the Alter Rebbe that he had Rebbe Yitzchak supporting him and defending him. You know, the Alter Rebbe was close to Reb Nachum of Chernobyl also, but Reb Nachum had already passed away in the end of Tavkuf Nuns, I think. And Ramatul already was also more on this other derech, and this Maisis how the Alter Rebbe was upset at Ramatul, Dafka, that Ramatul's going off the derech.
Yeah, there's a lot of...
So yeah, without getting too much into it, but it seems like this is the context. Whatever the exact impetus for these talks was, the context seems to be something to do with this whole parsha, and that is leading the Alter Rebbe to talk mamash as a sharf, like in these sichas, about how mekanish bekatrik zayin of Hayid. And I don't know if he's saying it as almost like a musar that they're being mekatrik on Chabad, or he's telling it to his own people that no matter what they do, you can't be mekatrik on Hayid. Maybe that's talk of the pshat. It's hard to know for sure because it doesn't spell it out. But as Reb Nuchem pointed out in that article, it's not just it is over and over again. Barichas, Bekitzer, it's a theme throughout Tavkuf Samachei, throughout the Achzarius of the Mekatrigim. Another place in that year is Parshas Emer in the Bir on Zayar. The Alter Rebbe said that year Emer. Right, you have this lashon there. K'mashinir ba'alil lamata af b'Yisrael. Anoshim bliyal. Here he says it the clearest of all. Faran yidden that are anoshim bliyal, roim betivam shlechta mention. Their whole chayis is from being poyel shlechts, and the punishments and this and that. And this mimer of Emer, hanacha of the Mittel Rebbe, was copied by the Tzemach Tzedek into Derech Mitzvah in Leisav Aru Eish, and that's where this idea is probably most famous to most people. If you ever heard of this idea from Chassidus Chabad, you're probably familiar with it from Leisav Aru Eish. When I was younger, I remember it being shown to me in Leisav Aru Eish, and often it comes up, in the last dur when the topic would come up with kanoim, and the kanoim that seemed to have a geschmack in fighting and hurting and beating and a schlachtskeit. So when Chabad had its own run-ins with certain groups, without getting into names, but like there was a sense that there's a certain like schlachtskeit radiating from certain people. So like this was always the maramakim. Like look in Leisav Aru Eish and you'll see our hashkafa on people who are kanoim. There's different versions, whether it's anti-this and that, all these different versions. Often you end up seeing there's a certain schlachtskeit and a geschmack in tan schlechtayit. So that lashon in Leisav Aru Eish is taken from the beer on Zayar of Emor of Tavkuf Samachei. In Tavkuf Samachei, the Anacha there is more bekitzer. Mittel Rebbe, when he wrote it, Kedarkai, Knitter wrote it a bit more bo'ef and siyuri, and the Tzemach Tzedek, who doesn't always prefer to quote Mittel Rebbe, here he quotes Mittel Rebbe. So that lashon that everyone knows from Derech Mitzvah Leisav Aru Eish is actually like the lashon of Mittel Rebbe. Derech Dugma, Neroim Lamata, Yesh B'nei Adam, She'ikr Chayusim Hu.
Is there an official way? I've never noticed, but like, does it say anywhere where the Maimorim of the Mitzvah come from?
If you look in the Maimar Kaimis in the back and the standard cost editions of the last few decades, just like Gut Torah, look in the back and they'll tell you, they'll say on each ois. Usually each ois is from a different Maimar. So if you want to learn different Mitzvah in the Mak, understand what the Tzemach Tzedek was doing, and he was creating sugyas and copying a shtickle from this mimer, then copying a shtickle from that mimer, and pasting them together. It's a fascinating work. It could get its own hour of discussion at least. There's also a Chikeres. I wrote an interesting article about Derech in the last 5 years or so, which contributed. I think I disagreed with her characterizations, but it was interesting. At least got the discussion going. Derech is a very fascinating work. But we don't have time to get into that right now. So he says, you see this Bnei Adam, their whole chayis is, their poyel din, lamashal, When they meet an Oshim every Aveda, take of Mischamim Levavam, Yismalu Chemo Vakas, Lahanisham, Lahakoisam, Makas Achzori with Tzicha Mamish. By the way, part of this Nagdus Tachsidim Bechlal locally also was an expression of the communities back then. They had punishments, they had the kuna, they had the stocks, they had the jail room near the shul. They had a final punishment, and there were people. Munchen wrote about how the Vilna had the Reidif Hanelam. They had like a secret prosecutor who had the unlimited ability to indict people and punish people. There's so many mechanisms for punishing people in the Kohol system of the time. Maybe this gets back into the whole Alter Rebbe thing with the Russian government versus the Polish, and maybe the Alter Rebbe didn't like that system being in place and preferred to be under Russian bureaucracy, which limited the Kohel's ability to punish. So maybe this is also an expression of that, where you have people that's their zach. In the Shpak and the Shtetl, you have people that was their zach. They were the Ivri Aveda catchers. They found a teen up to no good, and they got him. And they hurt him, and they did, they did terrible punishments to people. They would, even related to Barditchev, how he was chased out of whichever city it was before Barditchev. They say he was chased out on a garbage wagon, on the wagon of the garbage disposal. There were so many ways to hurt someone and harm someone and shame someone. And there were probably people that went off today. There's people that go off the derech because they were treated poorly, right? There's awareness about that. Back in the shtetl, it was often geschmat chas v'shalom, and the weiter people definitely shmat chas v'shalom because could be they were caught in an avera, and the punishers came and caught them and gave them a real treatment, and the guy ran off and so geschmat. Nothing's really changed. So this sounds a little bit like calling out these types of people. That if this is your whole zach, that you hear and they don't rest until they hurt them, that's because tivam rab etzem, they're pashat shlechte mention, and therefore whatever shlechts they can do, that gives them chayas, that gives them energy. Without that, they wouldn't have chayas. And when they get the pulas of the tzicha, kilu mischadish nafsham, mitl Rebbe mamish, the tzir, the Rebbe's b'tzayir azach, you really see it here, it's beautiful. They get the pulas of the tzicha, it's like they get a renewed chayas. The new chayas is poured into them. Miyat, meaning hagam shel bishu adover l'shem shamayim. No, it's l'shem shamayim shover aveda. Ein ze emes klaus, nicht emes, because the Eibishter is mali rachman. There's no pula of ra that comes from the Eibishter in ra. Yered malamayla. There's din, there's shluchi hadin, and they're tevei the din. And if there's maskim, so you see some of this teichen that we saw earlier from Hashem Yachat Meriov, same teichen. Maybe the Mittel Rebbe even inserted it from there. But the people that are actually involved in the stuff, it's Meza, Geroya HaNefesh, Gvuris Koshes, Lahariya, Lahanish, Vishluchi Adin, Malachi Chabala. So this is like I said, this is where it's most famous from. But if you look at the Mamar of Tafus Samachay, so you see the more context and where it's coming from. There's one place where the Rebbe actually is mitzayin to this, and Kut Silas Chelik of Zion, Tazriya Beis, page 90, based on the halachas of being Reya, the Nega. The Rebbe says the Ira is when you see a double Tevrech Man al-Islam by another Yid, until it seems like it's Hoitzi, it's Atzim in a klal, you have to kick him out of Machne Yisrael. He's a Nagua, a Mitzayra, Zak Teira, that Afilu Achacham Gadol, Baki Bechol Teira Kula. His Shikal Adas, Chacham Satayra, is that Yener, is right some sack. Before you give a zapsak, if the frier is a good beichen sein, women halten der Midah von Chesed and Avos Yisrael. Spelt Chas Shalom and Avos Yisrael, you don't have any right to issue such a psak of another Yid. Could be the psak is not coming from a reinim shikol adas shel Torah, but from midas bilti muvaroris chulu. But this actually gets to my point about being mekatrigam. You see how the Rebbe, even in describing the bad people, also says it as a edel. Could be, it's not coming from Shikal Adas Shal Teira, nor from Midas Bilti Mivaroris Hulu. Bittel Rebbe, the Tzayir Geven, the Schlechte Mensch, the Schlechte Mensch, Rebbe says it as Achma Ed. But in the footnote, Rebbe is mitzayin to Avai Yechatu Nasei, look at the Teira, that's the first Avai Yechatu Tavkuf Samachay. The Derech Mitzvah which is Emer Tavkuf Samachay, and Yechatu number 2, Rebbe is mitzayin Yechatu Tavkuf Samachay, page ratio Dalad, which is the second Yechatu of Parshas Boy. So in that footnote, it's mitzayin to taka these Makaidas. So you can see how the Rebbe is.
Rebbe spoke about it 3 times within a short span.
I think Reb Nuchem is mitzayin to 1 or 2 additional places in that year. Also, the kids, like mentioned in passing, but like that was like the big yisoid of that year that the Alter Rebbe used. And the Rebbe definitely uses this. Once you are like more aware of this, you'll see how often the Rebbe is invoking it, whether clearly or it's implied. It runs throughout the Rebbe's Torah that Zay B'derech Klal. Obviously, there are some times that the Rebbe also called out things that were bad or harmful. That's why it's nuanced, especially being Mekatlik on a Mekatlik is a nuanced thing. But Stamazite, unprompted, unprovoked, to just be Mekatlik on Yidden, that's a Yisrael by the Rebbe, that Metut. So we see that out the Rebbe, it's schon gekocht them back in Tovkov Samachay. So this is where I wanted to mention that we have this article from Menachem Greenwald's in Heichal Abash, number 39, which came out the winter of Tavshin Pei. He wrote an article, Haroya Shebe Kanos, Mishnas Admon Azaken, and so that's where he stellt sich on this in Yenus Malak from Tovkov Samachay. I had read it at the time, and I was reminded of it now as I was going through it. I saw someone in a Ha'ar being mitzayin to it. I said, right. So I pulled it off the shelf. I looked at it again. And one of the things he points out, like I mentioned, is it's interesting. Alter Rebbe mentions a story. The question is, what's the story, right? Alter Rebbe says, "Okay, the Maisa, the Magma Zichler Rotzel Lekal." What's the Maisa? So Nuchem suggested that there's a Maisa Reb Chaim Noah writes in his fight over Shiurim. I'm not going to say with who, but his fight over Shiurim. So he mentioned in the Hakdamat, one of his Kontreisim, like a Sharf of Vart, about how there was a Meister by the Magids. I think the story is supposed to be about of Karlin's son. I guess it would be Usher of Stalin. I don't know if he writes the names there, but there was a Talmud of the Magid who passed away young, and they were all chipping in and sort of helping to raise the son. But then the son was doing something with a Nishkatoikt. So the answer they came up with is that we should threaten the child with Chedem. That if he doesn't fix his ways, he will threaten him with Chedem, and that's for sure going to get him in line. The Maggid said, first of all, it's Nishkar, it's not true, he doesn't deserve a Chedem. Whatever he did is not on that level. And also, I'm Chayshish of a Kpeda of his father, in Elul Ma'emes. So in the end, they came to the Alter Rebbe came up with a chap that you can threaten him with a Chedem, but be mechaven to Chedem with a chaf. So you're not really threatening with a real Chedem. He's going to understand Chedem. That's just a mistake that he's going to make himself. Really, we're threatening him with a Chedem that's Hadish to Talmud Garnet, and that's a trick that's allowed, and so that's like the punchline. Whatever Reb Chaim Noah takes from that and applies to that situation. So Nuchem suggested that that's the Maisa that maybe the Alter Rebbe is referring to. But someone in Kovetz Haaretz that year of Aliter Yud Shvat Tavshin Pei, I think it was a Bacher, pointed out that what's up is this story. L'cher is a much more pashut hasber, which is the whole ma'aser. The Frierdiker Rebbe writes about it. Other chassidim bring it that b'shas the machlekes against when the charamis against chassidim became very powerful in the last year of the Maggid Mezrich. What's the ma'aser that the chassidim, that the Talmidei Maggid wanted to put the misnagdim or the reishim misnagdim in chedem. And there's, I think, a Rishim of the Frierdiker Rebbe. The Frierdiker Rebbe writes a whole ha'ara about what a real chedem means with the candles and mamish. It severs the person's neshama. It's a real serious thing. And the Maggid said, "B'shveidish nisht." That b'shumay for nisht. That's not the way to do it. That's not the way to go. And then in the end, they did do a shtikol chedem. And the Maggid said, "Of course, you did that. Now I'm going to pass away." That's why Taka passed away that year of the Mechlekas Tov Kol Amud Beis. But Alpha BK. But the punchline is, Yad Chassidim Al Yoyna. That's where that line comes from that story. So that's a story where you see befeish that the Maggid Leiratza Lekalo didn't want to curse someone. It stims a lot more. And I think the person's heart is gerech. It's mistaber yoser, because that's a much more bavusta story, a much more yisoidistic story. Mistaber yoser, that the story. Also in that story, it's taka it's the chashash not to be mekal. And the story that the Chaim Noah brings, it wasn't even the chashash. The chashash was he doesn't deserve it. It's going to be a kpeda. That's not even the same chashash. Nuchem says, okay, it's kind of the same, or maybe that part is not meduyik, but here it's much more meduyik, much more geschmack. That's referring to this famous story. So Abazoya means the Alter Rebbe is meramis to it. It's not just a Maisa from later date, it's the Maisa the Alter Rebbe is meramis to Bekitzer in this Maimer or Sicha. One more point I would add to what Reb Nuchem wrote there is in Ha'ara there he wrote that l'chayra of this whole sugya that he was malakat there. The Deber Maschabay Yechatu and the Container Nasa is the only place where this idea of the Achzarias, etc., went into Likutei Torah. And even there, it's only Bekitzer, and if you look in the other Hanacha, etc. But according to what we're saying here, L'chayra V'lay Ava that we started with, and Kiseitze also has this idea alluded to both in Likutei Torah, where it sort of said just as Bechlalos, that's a Bilam, Kacha Yadarke Shel Bilam, and in the Mittel Rebbe's Hanocha it's a little clearer, V'chol Mishim Achapes, Nikra B'Shem Bilam. So, in my opinion, I would say that V'lei Ava, which is from a year later, Kiseitzi Tafel Samach Vav, also is alluding to that year the Alter Rebbe wasn't kaching sich in the Inyan maybe as much, but V'lei Ava is also alluding to this, and that's why we started with V'lei Ava, we went to Havai Yechatu, and one has been signed to the other. And by the way, both are connected to Rosh Hashana. Both V'lei Ava, which is Mamash said before Rosh Hashana, it mentions Rosh Hashana, but also Havai Yechatu from Nasa is also, like I said, it's a pasuk from Haftarah Rosh Hashana. And then at least one of the Havai Yechatus, I think the second one, it mentioned Rosh Hashana as well, so it's very Rosh Hashanah Zach in Indian, so it's appropriate to be talking about this now. Now, a very interesting tie-in to the Rebbe. We like to quote from the Rebbe, from Reagan to the Rebbe, wherever possible. We quoted earlier from Yud Gimel Elul, Tafshim and Beis, about the Melech Basada, but the Inyan that I really wanted to quote from is a very fascinating thing. I don't think it's a very famous Sikha, but I came across it as I was looking into this Inyan. And it works out. It's perfect because Tafshim and Beis is the year that all the Spitz Chabadnikas have been going through because it's the same Kvias as the Sir Tafshim Peivav. So this whole Kvutza of Yidden that were going through the Fabringas of Tafshim and Beis Taka. I was a bit late to the bandwagon. I joined around the Pesach time, was when I Chabzich and catch up on the earlier part of the year, but caught up to the idea, to the club, to the program. So Yud Gimel Elul is interesting for bringing that year. For bringing Yud Gimel Elul in the weekday, the covered the day that the Fiat Rebbe was married, got married. Interesting for bringing. So it's a weekday for bringing. There's a recording. So there's a very interesting section of that for bringing. Bechlal, as we'll see shortly, in the mems, in the early mems, Kama v'Kama Shanim, around this time, the Rebbe was moicha against a certain group. Again, we're not going to get into names, but there's a certain group that was considered sort of the nemesis of Chabad. All the Hashkafis were punkt verkehrt, and Chabad also had the sense that there was a certain Schlachtzkeit and Achzarius coming from that direction. Now this group has a yard site either right at the end of Av, beginning of El, there's a big yard site there, Kayadua. And so the manik of that group would give a Yartzai Drasha, and the Mamshichim of that group today give Yartzai Drashas around this time. And part of the Malach, the signon of that group, is Taka written a bissel Musardik, a bissel negative. So I didn't look up to see exactly what, I don't know if I ever saw the exact talks. Some of there are recordings in that world, in that Elul. I'm sure they have recordings from those talks. But, a Geshmaka talk is when there's a you call something out, etc. So, in a number of Eluls in the early Mems, the Rebbe would react and say, Haytachin, to come into Elul, and to speak negative about Yidden. So this is one of them, but here the Rebbe goes even further in a very surprising way, as we shall see. And Bechlal, I think also around this time, another point of background is that I think in the early Mems, Mem Amalf and Beis, I think there was a lot more talk from the Rebbe about how the Welt shackelt sich, even though at that time the Cold War between America and the USSR was at the height of the Cold War, or was already starting to draw down the way the history is told. But the Dafka seems like the Rebbe had some concerns, Dafka at the beginning of the 80s, that something could go wrong, something could blow up. I think they say the famous close call, that's like a famous thing now, how the American or the Russian missile defense system, the alert system, went off and claimed that the opposing country was sending a hail of nuclear missiles, and I think the Russian system went off incorrectly, and they've identified whoever the Russian officer was that made the call not to go ahead with the plan of what to do in case a hail of nuclear missiles are incoming and to respond with a hail of nuclear missiles. But he made the call that it's probably just an error. And I think we know his name now, and people say, wow, Yamamish is the hero that saved humanity. So I think that happened around that time. So there definitely were things going on behind the scenes that were very tense, and the Rebbe was concerned about that. So it could be the Rebbe is also alluding to that, or we have to look into what else may have been happening at the time. But the Rebbe said, we see that when B'Shatz Malchus Misgara Zu B'Zu, when there's tension, there's geopolitical tension between nations, so Yidden are always the victim. So danach lassen ois helfen sie dem Kaser in Seseni Yisrael. Here the Rebbe mentioned a very interesting thing. So the Rebbe says, if you get the mall about the Munkatcher. Munkatcher was a Paisik, Sayanigla, and also Hanhagas, Teres Achsidis. So the Rebbe quotes an interesting thing b'shem the Munkatcher. It's Gedruk b'Shmai that during World War I, the Rebbe says the Mechama HaYedua, that's called Mechama HaRishayna. The Munkatcher Shita was, darf sich dit mission in the Eibish's Balabatischkeit. We don't know what's good and what's not good. So we have to let whatever happens happen, let it play out. So we shouldn't daven for the war to end, we shouldn't daven for shalom, we should just daven a bracha bakasha klalis, but not oistaichen about the Muhammad. So l'chayra from there sounds like even if there's war, there's tension, you should, according to the Munkatcher, we're not supposed to say it's bad and hope it ends. So I said l'chalarish is minit acharaya as gesagt, and it's hard to say that someone invented it from Aleph to Taf. But sometimes, if you move one word from one place to another place, etc., you get a whole different pirush. Now, before I continue, I just want to be misyachas because yes, people are going to learn the sikha now. What's the Rebbe referring to in this section? So there's actually a volume that I have. There's a volume in Munkatch called Chamishim Amaris, like lengthier divrei Torah, lengthier. They turned into essentially essays that the Munkatcher, I don't know if he wrote them or he had it written up, whatever the exact say there was, but they were issued officially from the Munkatcher. One of them is about the Nusachat Tefillah, which they just printed now as a separate standalone volume, the Mochein Emes and Munkatch today in Borough Park, that we published all of the Munkatcher, the Bnei Yisrael Svarim, and Darkei Tshuva. So now they just printed the Maimer on Nusach as a separate volume. But there's Chamishim Amaris that have like big chashuva, you say this like Mamaris of the Munkatcher. So a few years ago.
Some of the reason you're not mentioning your pet peeve is because you know that you've already mentioned it on a previous recording.
Plus?
Some of the reason you're not mentioning your
pet which, what? Well, what is it? What?
Chamisha Mamoris.
I didn't get to the Chamisha Mamoris is fine, because Chazal, you have Asara Mamoris. The problem is the volume that I'm about to mention now. Now, 14 years ago, they put out Chamisha Mamoris Nesofis. That's the problem. Mamaris has a vav sof suffix, but it's lashon zacher. So if you want to put out part 2, it's chamisha mamaris nesofim. So chamisha mamaris was fine. Mamaris could be mamaris, mamarim. Both are acceptable. But regardless of which one you use, it's still the masculine. So to have we know the Chassidim are not makban and zacher and Ashkenazim are not makban and zacher and but when it's in the title of the book, yeah, it's a bit of a cringe.
Okay, you're just right.
So in Chamisha Mamaris Nesafais, exclamation mark, as you do in bibliography when there's a mistake in the title. One of the Mamarim is Kuntrus Mashmir Yeshua. Kuntrus Mashmir Yeshua is an anonymous kuntrus that was printed from the circle of the Munkatcher, and they write there, I think it was written by a Talmud, one of his top Talmidim, but it was written at his behest. So the whole Teuchen of Kuntrus Mashmir Yeshua was essentially the Munkatcher Shita during World War I on this Nakoda, that you're not supposed to daven for the war to be resolved, for there to be shalom, but rather you should daven that it should be Chav the Mashiach, and the Mashiach should come, and whatever needs to play out should play out. So that kuntrus is about it. And in the Akdama to that volume, they're mitzayin to Tshuva of the Minchas Elazar and Chelek Dal. I don't remember if you look when Chelek Dal was printed, but there's a Tshuva Chelek Dal where he writes the same thing Befedish, and it is Befedish in a number of other places, in Shah Yisaskar, I think somewhere, and there's other Mamarim, I think Chamisha Mamaris, I think there's a Maimer Tzakah B'Shefer, call many places where if you search in Munkatcher Sefer Shleim Ha'amim, that's sort of the key word, where whenever he mentions Shleim Ha'amim, you'll see he's not pro davening for Shleim Ha'amim. So someone said that's also mentioned in the Sefer Darchei Chaim V'Shalom, which is on Haggis that a Talmud wrote. So it could be that's what the Rebbe is referring to. It's in Darchei Chaim V'Shalom, so it's not it's Minit Achrei, as Tozei Gazak. So maybe the Rebbe was saying in reference to that. But L'Chera, based on the full body of the Munkatcher's work, it does seem like this is pretty much an official stance of the Munkatcher that he repeated in a number of places. But then the Rebbe adds, interestingly, like this reminds me a little bit of other things with the Shpal Zed and the Rebbe Saris. The Rebbe leaves. The Rebbe says, first of all, maybe it's not. Second of all, Naniach Hafilu as gesagt, wie das ist gedrückt b'Shmai, is es nicht kein Hechrech, as das ist Sheiches zu kol azmanim v'kol mochams. So the Rebbe says, and even if he didn't say it, who says it's negaya to other situations, right? So which taka, certainly, I think even in Munkatcher they could agree that the Munkatcher was talking about World War I, which was a very unique event. and he saw it as Chav the Mashiach. So to him, if you daven for it to stop, it's like davening Chav the Mashiach should stop. If you daven Chav the Mashiach should stop. So you're being ma'akev Mashiach. You want Mashiach to come, you have to daven the Chav the Mashiach should be Neskayim, and then Mashiach should come. So there was a specific cheshbon. It wasn't just a general thing that we should never mix in and never daven for Shlem Amim. It could be there's a bit of that mashmos, but certainly half of the coin back then was specifically the Chav the Mashiach angle. So therefore, the Rebbe says, that's how I'd be mefarish. The Rebbe says that it can hechrich that kol azman and kol mochamis you should never daven for peace for Shlem Amim, especially when you know that Yidden stand to suffer. But back then, Munkatcher was an outlier with that. They write in the Chamishim Amoris Nesofis in the Akdama that all the other Gedolim wanted to make up say Yom Tainis to daven for Shalom, and the Munkatcher was screaming Chai V'Kayim that Chai V'Kayim is doch a Yom Neroim dik expression. Chai V'Kayim Neroim Modern B'Kodesh. The Kashinim Chai V'Kayim that that's not the right shita. So there's more information on that. But the Rebbe says it as well that they said it b'shem Munkatcher.
Where did you say that part is recorded? That.
Well, I said it that someone said that it's brought in Darchei Chaim v'Shalom. I didn't have a chance to look it up. So Mistama, I think the Rebbe of all the Munkatcher Svarim, I assume the Rebbe looked at Darchei Chaim v'Shalom the most because it's Neget Hanhagas Lamaisa, which is the Iker Idyon the Rebbe is interested in. I saw recently that when the Rebbe was koching zich, what was it about? It was like a sich in the lamed, like a sharp sich in the lamed. It's like in the back of the Sichos Kodesh for that year. The Rebbe was koching zich about something to do with Rabbanos and Eretz Yisrael, maybe about like the Rabbanut Rashit. So the Rebbe was mitzayin that there's a big tshuva of the Minchas Elazar about Rabbanos for money, like a very sharp political tshuva of the Minchas Elazar. So the Rebbe brought it into the picture. As I said, there's a tshuva of the Munkatcher. So this came from recently in all the Chassidish Haifen now, they put out the Kuntresim of all the conversations, of all the Bikur Shalmimos and Bikur Goimlin, all the visits back and forth, all the Rebbes do to each other, 10% of their time during the week. So they write down the transcript. So there was a conversation between the current Munkatcher of Park and someone else. So he was saying his memory that back in the Lameds, he was a younger man, but I guess already then, I think he was already officially the Munkatcher Rebbe running the Maistas, and he was, achroi for the Sifrei Munkatch. He said in the Lameds, all of a sudden, his bell kept on ringing every couple of minutes with another Lubavitcher at the door, because the Rebbe mentioned in the Fabrengen, Minchas Elazar, so they were all coming down to his house to get the Minchas Elazar, to find the Minchas Elazar, or whatever exactly. That's his memory of the incident. I think the way he repeated the background, I think he mentioned the not correct Rav of who the Rebbe was referring to, but after someone shared that excerpt from his conversation, I went and found the Sichot. In Sichos Kodesh, you can find where the Rebbe mentioned that. So that's the Minchas Elazar that the Rebbe mentioned, the Tshuva Minchas Elazar. I think B'derech Klal, the Rebbe will look probably the most at Darchei Chaim v'Shalom. So I'm assuming the Rebbe was referring to that. Just because it says in Darchei Chaim v'Shalom doesn't mean that it's a fact. But I think in this case, with access to a larger body of Munkatcher's Torah, which Lav Dafka was fully available and accessible, and the Munkatcher Bar Park has done a good job getting the material out there, we do see that Munkatcher definitely repeated variations of this, said it and wrote it in a number of places. But like the Rebbe says, it's not a hechrich that it's shaykh or shaykhs to kol azman and kol mochamis. So first the Rebbe starts off this thing by saying that when there's malchis miskara zu bezu, they let it out on Seinei Yisrael, B'lashon Saginar, which is really obviously referring to Yid. Then the Rebbe adds, so when there's a Mochama, so when there's a Heder Achayim by a Nit Yidden, is that it's also something a Yid should feel concerned about. It's also something a Yid should intervene for. So, and that's just giving them food to help them, to support them. So, the Indian from Chaim Kipshuta, that we have to care about the lives of of Nit Yidden. Never mind, like the Rebbe says, that weiter, it doesn't just affect them. It affects not Mamoinim Shel Yisrael, but Gufim Shel Yisrael. Ultimately, Yidden do suffer. But the Rebbe is going further and adding that a Yid has to care about the life of every human, and Madoch from Mafarnas and Mani Yaakov. The Rebbe says, der Favel Chzog Gora Dover, that's Mistama, but Mitzach Gleich Unheben Sheppen. That's a Dover Mavel. There's about to say something shocking, and the people that like to shepherd with what the Rebbe says and pick on things the Rebbe says are probably going to pick on this. And was haste, they're going to say, I'm using Elul, Yidden gathering in Elul to say such a thing. but the Rebbe says that this is an inyan that's in der Ois gehalten, but es darf so sein, op die Teure, that bedarf sich aushitten von sagen, a dover bilti toiv, euch benegea, zu a nit yidden. You have to be careful not to say a negative word, also about a nit yidden. Because when you say a bad thing, you're mamshach about hepech habracha into the world. You see all the Rebbe's euphemisms. Mamshach even hepech habracha. Rebbe says, right now, we're in a maimed amatziv, we're in a place, a matziv, a maimed, the Rebbe says, we're in a situation right now, as medarf de trunken, die ganze Welt, in yonim shal brachas betoiv hanirav hanigler. Right now, what the world needs is we need to douse it, we need to cover it, just in positivity. That's what we need in the world right now. And the mela, all the ra and hepech hatoiv that affects Yidden will also disappear. So if you want things to be good for Yidden, you have to daven for the safety and the good of the world. And the Rebbe says, we say Yitamu Chatan B'Lechaitim. Usually we say about Yidden. The Rebbe says we have to apply it also. B'Shas is Do Anit Yid. He's also Mechuyev in Shemitz B'nei Noach. And the Eibishter told Moshe Rabbeinu to tell the Yidden, called Eidos Kulam, that if you can find an opportunity to be Mashpir upon Yidden, you have to tell them. B'nei Noach, obviously there's something the Rebbe kocht in the Mems. And the Rebbe says, there's a svara that Sheva Mitzvahs B'nei Noach Batlu, Pashtos B'nei Noach Mechuyev B'zmanim Elu, and Sheva Mitzvahs, and it's also Shevas Yitzara, etc., etc. So you have to be Mispal B'Shloi Ma'ir. So to be Mispal B'Shloi Ma'ir, and then to say a Kitrug, that's a Davar V'Puchay. So B'chlal, the Yana cries. I don't know, maybe it's something that cries said, maybe this is also part of the Rebbe's reaction to something they said. Right, so that cries is very into not being misgara b'umis and being mispal b'shlem eir, and they bring American flags to their protests. Right, they have like a certain patriotic schnit, a certain patriotic streak to them. But at the same time, it could be in their talk, it could be they're also shayach to zagan hakitrub. So the Rebbe is saying, if you're into being mispal b'shlem eir, then how can you say a kitrub of a nityid? Even a nityid, you have to not be mekatrik and not be mamshech hepech habracha. You have to only bring positivity. The Rebbe says, doch the shayla, es ist doch a zoyne von sei, was ist eine mazikim, mechablim, v'chulu v'chulu. This is the mechablim that I referred to earlier. When the Rebbe says mechablim, it sounds like the Rebbe is even referring to what we call in today's terminology mechablim. The Rebbe says, it's hafteruf, is the hera and taira, as yitamu chatam. The principle of yitamu chatam applies in this situation as well. We have to do ala megalchaitim, ala in yonim hafshariyim, to take away the opportunity, take away the possibility that they could be mazik, and then work on bringing about etc., etc. It says yesh laharach, but kamaduber, there are those that are going to taina hayitochen using a half an hour in Elul. You're saying not only that you shouldn't say Musar to Yidden, which is usually what the Rebbe's response would be, not to say Musar to Yidden, but now mitzvah geredes mitzvah, or they're going to say b'lashonim chas v'shalom the opposite. The Rebbe doesn't want to say the opposite lashon mitzvah geredes mitzvah, that they're going to say as referring to himself. They're going to, Rebbe says, already see what's going to happen. They're going to be by adding that is nikra gavarin, that from rejecting the Musar on Yidden, he went as far as to say that even a non-Jew nit melamed hepech haschus sein. Says, I know I'm going to probably get flack for this, but snitkin egen oiftu. This is a din and Torah v'spal b'shlei meir v'shavas yitzara shamitz b'nei Noach. So Mamela, that's the Rebbe's stance. That's what the Rebbe was saying in Tafshim Beis, that he can't be moicha just on the Musar Keneged Yidden. He has to be moicha on the Kitur Keneged Nit Yidden. That the Rebbe stuck his neck out kivayachol to say that. It's interesting because there was just a video going around like a month ago.
He's not with the Rebbe didn't mention the Maimon of the Torah.
No. Yeah, no. But definitely there's a tushto, and I saw that in some Chabad magazine from a few years ago, they were mitzayin, they made a connection. They said, oh, this Maimer, Samachei, is like a nice background to what the Rebbe says, and this forbidding in Yud Gimel El Tavshim and Beis. It's clearly the same Teichim. Because even if the Rebbe is not quoting, we mitzayin, but you see how the idea is present and is latent and travels all the way from Tavkuf Samachei to Tavshim and Beis. The Rebbe says the same inyan. The Rebbe says it's not an Egen Oiftu, right? It's not an Egen Oiftu. So here you see that the Alter Rebbe already said it in Tavkuf Samachei. It's interesting because there was a video Taka making the rounds very recently from Tafshin and Beis, winter Tafshin and Beis, where it's Yisrael dik Dati Lumi, Rebbe Eliezer Waldman, went by the Rebbe. He starts telling the Rebbe, I've been darshaning, that we see that every nation that started up with the Yidden, they ended up in the dust heap of history, and the same will happen. Today the Rebbe cuts him off and says, well, why are you saying negative things about Umas Ha'olam? The same Teichen, but the Kitzer. He says, there's a Gemara. That was okay, he'll put that Gemara with the other Gemara. You don't have to talk about every Gemara, which is its own interesting. I was just talking to someone about this idea of, are there things that are true, but we don't have to say it? There is such a musik by the Rebbe in a number of places where the Rebbe says, just because something is true doesn't mean you have to push it in people's faces. And the Rebbe seems to apply that to this as well. And like this, the Rebbe expresses the sentiment very clearly that it's not the right thing to do to wish ill on Umas Ha'olam. We need Umas Ha'olam to be doing fine. So we're in a matzav right now, going into Rosh Hashana. We're in a matzav right now where if you follow the news, not that we are mumchim to decide. Sometimes it could look bad, and the Rebbe would say it's fine, or it could look fine. The Rebbe could say things are not so fine. So it's not for us to say and decide. We look at a world where ongoing conflicts, whether it's in Eastern Europe or potential conflicts in other places, or even in Eretz Yisrael. It's nicht kompashte Zach, and if there's harm, there's damage, and the way the Alter Rebbe explains it, that any harm and damage is coming from klip and achra, and the way the Rebbe says it, that the world needs to have peace, the world needs to have stability, Yidden need to have peace and stability. So going into Rosh Hashana, these are things to think about. That we hope that next year is a year where whatever it takes, whatever the derech, whatever the path to peace is you have to hope for peace in the entire world. And obviously we know that the conflict in Eastern Europe affected lots of Yidden. Thousands, if not tens of thousands, had to flee in the early days and weeks and months of the war. And now that the war has been brought to the other side, so Yidden throughout both countries are suffering. This is people follow the news and they're rooting for this side, they're rooting for that side. From the Rebbe that you could feel one side is more correct, whatever. But apparently nicht to mekaterig sein, and to hope for peace, and to hope that both sides come to their senses and figure out a way to live b'shalom with each other. That would seem to be the correct hashkafa, the correct wish for the world and for the year, going into the year. And if those that follow the news and follow the war, right, and the drones and the robots, and there's the kaiches of death and destruction are getting stronger. And obviously, again, it's not for me to say whether we should be concerned or not, or whether everything will be fine, as Hashem, etc. But it's something to be mechaven, to keep in mind that we are aware of the potential, the possibility for harm, for damage, for death in the world. This is something that we don't wish to see. We wish to see peace and harmony in the world. So to summarize, from all the teichen, from all the pieces that we brought here, to summarize, I think the main points, the major points, is that number one, Yom Adin is a serious thing. The Kol HaDeis and all the Eidos, Yom Adin is a serious thing. And like I said, we all enjoy a good year, and we all suffer, Rahman al-Islam, from the hapech of a good year. It's not like you can not believe in bad years. That's not a thing. And steht in Yiddishkeit that the year is determined at this time. Like I said, is it 95% of what you're thinking about, or 25%? If you're on a Heiche Madrega, Gevaldik. Like we said at some point in the middle, taking away to just have less is not an Indian. It's adding. Where you have, in addition, what's 95% to someone else is we shrink it down to 25% and we add a whole Kabbalah Samalchus on top of that. But not to say that we don't care. Obviously, we want to have a good year, and obviously this is this is the time when the fate of the year is decided, and that's Bechlal, or that's Befrat. And then Bechlal, we see from the Rebbe Tashman Beis that we are concerned about the events that take place in the world, and we want there to be stability, we want there to be peace in the world. And the more instability there is, the more the risk is of more hurt and more harm and more death that can pull in anyone. And it affects everyone. The whole world is connected and interconnected. And that the Marash said in his Ma'amar Tavus Lamed Aleph, even if everything's B'Shvil Yisrael, so everything's B'Shvil Yisrael, everything's connected to Yid, and everything's connected in some way. So you can't escape the connection. So everything's interconnected. So this is something that we care about, we're concerned about. And as the Rebbe says, we have to strive and seek peace in the world. And as the Rebbe said then, and that the Alter Rebbe said in Talpus Amachei, not to be mekatrig nicht auf Yidden, nicht auf Nit-Yidden, auf Umasa'aylam. So I think that summarizes all the major points that we made. And this is all Merumiz in the Lei Ava that's in the Torah, Parshas Kiseitze. So that was all inspired by that. Any parting comments or thoughts?
My parting thought is that this is Mitzvah Shem going to be good practice for 2 nights from now, where it's going to be Taka Vachnacht.
Oh, we didn't say what time it is. Maybe it's.
We can make a recording. I saw the Rosh Hashana Taka says that the Sudas of Vachnacht are not null, so could Taka be that? Anyway, it'll be interesting. I think there's yet to be a proper skira on Minhogi Chabad of Vachnacht, so maybe we could do that for the Vachnacht. All right,
Clean there. And once again, Mazel Tov, and wishing everyone, Yidden and the whole world, Ksivach Simateva, Shanteva Masuka, Agut, Gebenched, Yar, Schos, and Bracha, and Al Inyanim.
All right.